Hello everyone, tonight I've got 15 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Nightspook, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. I was working late one night at my apartment and everything felt completely normal until I noticed something that didn't make sense. My name is Rowan Ellery, and I live alone on the Zero apartment complex. It's a small, single-bedroom unit tucked away at the very back of the property. Because of the way the building was constructed back in the 70s, my living room window faces a very narrow, useless strip of land. It's just a tiny gap that separates my building from the towering brick wall of an old warehouse next door. It's not exactly a scenic view. There's no sidewalk back there, no landscaping, and no reason for anyone to ever walk through it. It's just a patch of hard dirt and dry, overgrown weeds. Because of that, I always keep my living room blinds pulled down and twisted completely shut. I work from home as a freelance transcriptionist, which means I spend long hours sitting at my desk. My desk is pushed right up against the wall, positioned only a few feet away from that living room window. It was a Tuesday night, right around 11:30 p.m. I was deeply focused on my computer screen, typing out a long audio file in the quiet apartment. I had my headphones resting loosely around my neck, just enjoying the comfortable silence of the late hour. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a subtle change in the lighting of the room. I stopped typing, looked away from my bright monitor, and glanced over at the closed blinds. A pale yellowish light was drifting slowly across the cheap plastic slats. It wasn't the passing headlights of a car turning around in the parking lot. The angle was entirely wrong and the beam was far too focused. It looked exactly like the beam of a handheld flashlight. The light swept evenly across my window from left to right, moving at the pace of a steady, casual walk, and then faded away into the darkness. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just the building manager doing a late-night perimeter check, or maybe a neighbor who had lost their dog and was out searching the property. I shrugged it off, put my headphones back over my ears, and went right back to my work. I didn't even bother getting up to check the window. The next night I was sitting at my desk again. It was much later this time. Closer to 1 a.m. the apartment was completely silent except for the low, vibrating hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. I was reading through an email when I noticed the light again. Just like the night before, it was that same yellowish beam cutting through the darkness outside. It reflected faintly against my closed blinds, casting long, thin shadows across my desk. But this time, the movement was entirely different. It wasn't a steady, passing sweep. The light crept onto the left edge of my window very slowly. It hovered there for a few agonizing seconds, trembling slightly, before inching its way toward the center of the glass. It felt incredibly deliberate. It looked exactly like whoever was holding the flashlight was taking slow, careful, calculated steps. Something felt off. My stomach dropped slightly as I watched the beam of light stop dead in the middle of the window. It stayed there, completely stationary, for what felt like a full minute. Someone was just standing out there in the cold dark, facing my apartment directly. I sat frozen in my desk chair, not wanting to make a single sound. I didn't want them to know I was awake inside. Finally, with a faint visual flicker, the light clicked off. I waited a few more minutes, my heart beating a little faster than normal in my chest. When I was sure they were gone, I quietly got up, walked over to the window, and parted two of the plastic blinds with my fingers. I looked out into the narrow gap between the buildings, but it was pitch black. There was no street lamp back there, and with the flashlight gone, I couldn't see a single thing in the darkness. The following afternoon, the strange event was still bothering me, so I decided to go outside and take a look in the daylight. I walked around the side of the brick building and squeezed past some overgrown bushes to get into the narrow gap behind my apartment. When I stood right outside my own living room window, a deep feeling of unease washed over me. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be back here. It wasn't a designated walkway or a maintenance path. It was just a neglected dead end filled with broken glass, old trash, and thick patches of dry, dead grass. It led nowhere. To even get back here, a person had to intentionally leave the main sidewalk, walk all the way across the resident parking lot, and force their way past a line of thick, thorny bushes. No one was walking back here by accident. No one was using it as a convenient shortcut to the street. I looked down at the ground right below the glass of my window. The dirt was hard and dry, but the tall, dead grass was noticeably flattened into a wide circle. Someone had definitely been standing there, standing right outside my window, pointing a flashlight at my closed blinds in the middle of the night. I went back inside immediately and made sure every single window in the apartment was securely locked. I even went to the closet, found a thick wooden dowel, and wedged it tightly into the bottom track of the living room window, just to be extra safe. I tried to convince myself it was just some local teenagers messing around, but that weak excuse didn't make me feel any better. 2 quiet nights passed without any strange incidents. I slowly started to relax a little bit, convincing myself that whoever it was had gotten bored and moved on to bother someone else. Then came Friday night. I had stayed up much later than usual watching a movie on my laptop and completely lost track of the time. It was almost 2:30 a.m. when I finally closed the computer and headed toward the kitchen to get a glass of water before going to bed. To get to the kitchen from the hallway, I had to walk right past my work desk and the living room window. As I was walking past, the entire living room suddenly lit up. It wasn't a faint, sweeping beam this time. The light was blindingly bright, and it was shining directly through the thin gaps in my blinds. It cast harsh, horizontal shadows across my living room wall, illuminating the entire space with an ugly yellow glare. My stomach dropped. I stopped dead in my tracks, my bare feet frozen against the cold floorboards. The light wasn't moving at all. It was pressed right up against the outside glass. Whoever was out there was standing mere inches away from my window, shining a heavy-duty flashlight straight into my apartment. I stood there in the dark hallway, holding my breath so tightly my chest began to ache. I didn't want them to know I was awake. I didn't want them to know I was standing right there in the room with them, separated only by a thin pane of glass. Then I heard a sound. It was a soft, shifting noise coming from right outside the window. It sounded exactly like heavy boots shifting their weight on dry, dead grass. They were trying to look inside. They were adjusting their stance, trying to get a better angle to see through the tiny gaps in the plastic blinds. I felt uneasy, but I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I stayed low to the ground, keeping my back pressed flat against the hallway wall, and slowly crept toward the edge of the window. My hands were shaking uncontrollably at my sides. The bright light continued to pierce through the dark room. I reached the far edge of the window frame and carefully angled my head to look through the small slit where the final blind didn't fully meet the wall. The intense glare from the flashlight made it incredibly hard to see anything at first, but as my eyes slowly adjusted to the brightness, I could make out the dark, solid silhouette of a person standing just on the other side of the glass. They were tall, wearing a dark, heavy-hooded jacket pulled up tightly around their head and face. Suddenly, with a loud click, the flashlight was turned off. The living room was instantly plunged back into absolute darkness. I froze entirely, my face still hovering just inches from the cold glass. I couldn't see the dark figure anymore, but I knew for a fact they hadn't moved. I hadn't heard the dry grass crunch beneath their boots. They were still standing right there in the dark. In the heavy, suffocating silence of the apartment, I heard a sound that made me feel sick. It was a slow, raspy breathing sound, coming clearly through the poor insulation of the old window frame. They were leaning their face directly against the outside of the glass. I backed away as fast as I could without making a single sound. I practically crawled to the kitchen, grabbed my cell phone from the counter, and immediately dialed 911. I whispered my exact address to the dispatcher, telling them there was a man outside trying to break into my ground floor apartment. The police arrived about 10 agonizing minutes later. By the time I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting against my living room blinds, the raspy breathing outside had completely stopped. I quickly unlocked the front door, let the officers inside, and explained everything that had happened over the last few days. 2 of the officers went outside with their own heavy flashlights to thoroughly search the narrow dirt gap behind my apartment building. When they finally came back inside, their facial expressions were incredibly serious. They confirmed exactly what I already knew. The tall, dead grass right beneath my window was completely trampled down, packed flat into the hard dirt. Someone had been standing there for a very long time, but whoever it was had slipped away into the dark night long before the patrol cars ever pulled up to the curb. They filed an official police report and told me to call them back immediately if I saw the light again, but they admitted that was really all they could do for now. My apartment lease isn't up for another 5 months, so I simply can't afford to break the contract and move somewhere safer. I bought incredibly thick blackout curtains the very next day and installed a loud motion sensor alarm right on the window frame, but none of it really helps me sleep at night. Because almost every single night, usually right around 2:30 a.m., I can still see a faint yellow glow creeping slowly around the very edges of the heavy curtains. Why do they keep coming back? Story 2. I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at that highway rest stop, but it did. My name is Sienna Corbett. It was late on a Thursday night in late October, and I was making the long, exhausting drive back to my college apartment. I had spent a long weekend visiting my parents in a neighboring state, and the drive was normally a straight, boring 6-hour shot down a major interstate. By the time I hit the halfway mark, the highway was almost completely abandoned. I had been driving for over 4 hours in near silence, just staring at the endless stretch of dashed white lines glowing faintly under my headlights. The only sound in the car was the low hum of my heater and the static of a radio station I had forgotten to change. Around 11:30 p.m., the large coffee I had drank earlier finally caught up with me. I realized I couldn't wait any longer to find a place to pull over. The exits out in this rural area were spaced incredibly far apart, sometimes 20 or 30 miles between gas stations. When I saw the blue reflective surface of a rest area sign approaching on the right, I didn't hesitate. I quickly merged into the exit lane and followed the curving off-ramp into the dark trees. It was a very small, older rest stop. There were no fast food restaurants attached to it, and no gas pumps. It was just a plain, flat-roofed brick building surrounded by thick patches of dark woods on all sides. The parking lot was large but incredibly empty, illuminated only by a few tall, harsh halogen lights that cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. As I pulled my car into a parking space near the front entrance, I noticed there was only one other vehicle in the entire lot. It was a dark, older model sedan parked near the very back corner, backed neatly into a spot near the tree line. It was completely quiet, with its headlights off and no visible exhaust coming from the tailpipe. I didn't see anyone sitting inside. I grabbed my purse from the passenger seat, locked my car doors, and walked quickly toward the brick building. The night air was surprisingly freezing, biting through my thin sweater and making me want to get inside as fast as possible. I pushed my way through the heavy double glass doors and walked into the main lobby. Everything was entirely empty. The lobby was a wide-open square room featuring a row of brightly lit vending machines humming loudly against the far wall. The bright screens cast a colorful, unnatural glare across the cheap beige floor tiles. The building smelled heavily of industrial bleach and old, stale coffee. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see a tired janitor mopping the floor or another driver stretching their legs, but I was completely alone. I turned down the short, narrow hallway that led to the restrooms and pushed open the heavy wooden door marked for women. The bathroom was massive, much larger than it needed to be for such a remote stop. It had at least 10 dark green metal stalls lined up in a long row along the back wall. The fluorescent lights overhead were painfully bright, and a few of them were buzzing with a faint, steady electrical noise. I stood near the row of sinks for a second, just listening. There was no sound of running water, no movement, no rustling of clothing. I bent down slightly and looked under the long row of metal doors. The gap between the floor and the doors was fairly high. There were no shoes visible anywhere. The bathroom was completely abandoned. I walked all the way past the sinks, passing stall after stall, until I reached the very last one at the end of the room. It was the larger handicap stall, which I always preferred because the extra space just felt a lot less claustrophobic. I walked inside and pushed the heavy metal door shut behind me. I reached out to slide the metal latch into the locked position. The lock was a thick, silver sliding bolt covered in deep, heavy scratches from years of public use. I pushed it toward the receiving bracket on the doorframe, but it stopped halfway. It felt incredibly stiff and completely misaligned. I tried pulling the heavy green door inward slightly, wiggling it back and forth to make the metal pieces fit, but the thick bolt just scraped loudly against the frame without sliding into the hole. After a few frustrating seconds of fighting with the mechanism, I just gave up. The bathroom was totally empty anyway, and the heavy metal door naturally rested in a mostly closed position on its own. I figured it didn't really matter. I hung my purse on the small, rusted hook behind the door and sat down. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and started scrolling through my messages, just enjoying a brief moment of stationary rest from the long, hypnotic drive. The bathroom was so quiet that the faint electrical buzzing of the overhead lights sounded incredibly loud in my ears. The silence was heavy and isolating. About a minute later, I heard a sound that made me stop scrolling. It was a slow, harsh scraping noise. It sounded exactly like heavy metal dragging firmly against another piece of metal. I slowly lifted my head from my phone screen and looked straight ahead at the back of the stall door. The thick silver latch was moving. It was slowly sliding horizontally across the track, scraping against the metal housing as it went. I sat there in complete disbelief, my breath caught in my throat, watching as the bolt pushed itself all the way into the locked position. It finished its journey with a solid, heavy thud. My stomach dropped. I stared at the closed latch, my mind immediately racing to find a logical, everyday explanation for what I had just seen. I told myself it must have been gravity. Maybe the heavy metal door had slowly settled on its old hinges, causing the frame to shift just enough for the stubbornly misaligned bolt to finally slide into the bracket on its own. It sounded like a massive stretch, considering the bolt had to move horizontally against its own stiff friction, but I desperately wanted to believe it. I didn't want to entertain any other ideas. I finished up as quickly as I physically could. I stood up, grabbed my purse off the hook, and reached my hand out to unlock the door so I could leave. I grabbed the small round metal knob on the sliding bolt and pulled it firmly to the left. It didn't move. I squeezed the knob tighter with my fingers and pulled harder. It shifted about 1/4 of an inch and then completely stopped. I felt a very strange, almost elastic resistance. It wasn't the sudden, hard stop of metal jammed awkwardly against metal. It felt entirely different. It felt exactly like something on the other side of the door was actively pulling the bolt in the opposite direction. I felt uneasy. A thin layer of cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I kept my grip on the small metal knob, braced my boots against the tile floor, and pulled again, putting my actual body weight into my arm. The strange resistance held strong for a terrifying, agonizing second. Then, suddenly, it just let go. The silver bolt snapped back violently along the track, and the heavy green door swung open toward me. I stumbled forward out of the stall and into the main walkway of the bathroom, clutching my purse tightly to my chest, my heart pounding fiercely against my ribs. I immediately spun around, fully expecting to see a person standing right outside my stall door. There was no one there. The long row of green doors remained perfectly still in the harsh lighting. The sinks were empty. The fluorescent lights continued their dull buzzing overhead. I was completely alone. I didn't understand what had just happened. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I walked quickly over to the row of sinks. I turned on the cold water and practically scrubbed my hands, keeping my eyes glued strictly to the large, wall-to-wall mirror mounted above the counter. From my angle in the mirror, I could clearly see the reflection of the green stalls stretching out behind me. Something felt off. The heavy metal door of the handicap stall I had just used was resting wide open, just like I had left it. I reached over and pulled a rough paper towel from the dispenser, ready to run out of the building and get back to the safety of my car. As I crumpled the paper towel into a ball and turned to throw it into the trash can, I glanced back at the mirror one last time. The heavy door of the handicap stall was moving again. It was slowly swinging shut on its own. There were no windows in the bathroom to let in a draft. There was no air conditioning vent blowing forcefully from the ceiling above it. The heavy metal door simply glided shut with a smooth, deliberate motion until it met the frame with a quiet thud. I stood completely frozen at the sink, staring wide-eyed into the mirror. The reflection was perfectly clear. As soon as the door fully closed, I heard that same harsh, undeniable scraping sound echo through the empty tiled room. The thick silver bolt slowly slid all the way across the metal track, locking the completely empty stall from the inside. I didn't wait around to see anything else. I turned around and sprinted out of the women's restroom. I pushed violently through the heavy wooden door and practically ran across the brightly lit vending machine lobby. The glass front fridges were still humming loudly in the corner, but the absolute emptiness of the building felt completely suffocating now. I hit the front glass entrance doors with my shoulder and burst out into the freezing night air. I ran straight to my car, my hands fumbling nervously with my keys in the dark. I unlocked the driver's side door, threw myself inside the cold cabin, and slammed the door shut, immediately hitting the power locks. I sat there panting, my chest heaving up and down as I stared through my windshield at the plain brick building of the rest stop. My eyes drifted nervously across the expansive parking lot. The dark, older model sedan was completely gone. I hadn't heard a car engine start while I was inside. I hadn't seen headlights sweep across the glass windows of the lobby. The parking spot where it had been sitting near the tree line was just empty pavement under the harsh halogen lights. I slammed my car into drive and sped out of the rest area as fast as I could, merging recklessly back onto the dark highway without looking back in my rearview mirror. I drove the rest of the way home in complete silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I still think about that thick silver bolt sometimes, and those deep, heavy scratches carved into the metal. It makes me wonder about the resistance I felt. Who exactly was I fighting for control of that lock? Story 3. At first, I thought it was just my imagination while I was at the warehouse, until it happened again. My name is Declan Meyer, and I work overnight inventory at a massive distribution center. It is an incredibly large, windowless concrete building located on the industrial outskirts of the city. I work the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, which means I spend most of my time walking through rows of towering metal racks while the rest of the world is asleep. My specific assigned area is Section D, which holds mostly overstock appliances and heavy electronics that do not ship out very often. Because the warehouse is so large, the overnight staff is very small. Most nights, I'm the only person working in a space the size of a professional football field. The only sounds you ever hear are the deep, constant humming of the overhead ventilation system and the hollow echo of your own work boots hitting the concrete floor. A big part of my job involves walking down these long aisles with a handheld scanning device, verifying that the physical inventory on the shelves matches the numbers in the computer system. It is very repetitive work. When you stare at the exact same stacks of cardboard boxes night after night, your brain just naturally maps the area. You memorize where things belong without even trying. That is the only reason I noticed it. It was a Tuesday night, right around 1:15 a.m. I was walking slowly down aisle 44, scanning a row of bulky mini-fridge boxes on the bottom storage rack. These heavy boxes were sitting stacked together on a thick wooden pallet. As I walked past the stack, my scanner beeped and I looked down at the floor. The pallet was not aligned perfectly with the others in the row. It was jutting out roughly 2 inches past the bright yellow safety line painted on the concrete aisle. In a distribution center, anything crossing that painted yellow line is an immediate safety violation. A passing forklift could easily catch the wooden corner and pull the entire towering metal rack down. I thought it was slightly weird because Section D had not seen any forklift activity in over a week. I just figured a daytime driver got careless, bumped the rack, and did not bother to report it to management. I put the thick toe of my work boot against the rough edge of the wood and shoved it hard, sliding it back behind the yellow line. It made a loud, harsh scraping noise against the concrete floor. I finished the rest of my shift in peace and eventually went home. The next night, things got noticeably stranger. It was a little later in my shift, roughly 3:15 a.m., and the warehouse was completely dead. I was doing my final visual walkthrough of Section D before heading up to the break room for my lunch hour. As I turned the corner and started down aisle 44, my stomach dropped. The exact same wooden pallet was sticking out into the aisle again, but this time it was not just a minor bump of a few inches. The entire pallet was pulled outward almost 2 full feet, completely blocking half of the walking path. It was resting at a very awkward angle, almost as if someone had grabbed it by the front right corner and dragged it aggressively into the walkway. I stopped walking entirely. Something felt off. I stood right there in the middle of the long, empty aisle and just listened to my surroundings. The overhead fluorescent lights in our warehouse are entirely motion activated to save on energy costs. Every single light in the neighboring aisles to my left and right was completely dark. If a forklift had come down here while I was in another section, or even if another floor employee had just been walking by, those overhead lights would still be timed on. I was the only thing moving in this entire half of the massive building. I walked closer to the pallet and looked at it carefully. It held 4 large, incredibly heavy appliance boxes. There was absolutely no way a slight accidental bump from a passing machine could have shifted this much dead weight. Somebody had to have intentionally pulled it out from the rack. I looked down the long, dim corridor of towering metal shelving, but I didn't see anything. I just saw dark shadows in the endless rows of identical cardboard boxes. I felt uneasy, but I had a job to do. I did not want to get written up by the morning shift manager for leaving a clear tripping hazard in the walkway. I put my scanner in my pocket, grabbed the rough wooden edge of the pallet with both hands, braced my feet against the floor, and pulled upward and inward to straighten it. The heavy wood made that exact same loud, harsh scraping sound against the concrete floor. It took a significant amount of physical effort to push the heavy load back into its proper place beneath the metal shelf. I spent the rest of my Wednesday shift constantly looking over my shoulder. Every single time a distant metal rack settled under its own weight, or an air vent rattled near the ceiling, my head snapped violently in that direction, but nothing else out of the ordinary happened. When my shift finally ended at 8 a.m., I gladly walked out to my car and drove home, trying desperately to convince myself it was just some weird practical joke played by a bored coworker from Section C. I had Thursday night off, so I did not go back into the building until Friday evening. The warehouse felt even colder and more isolated than it normally did. A severe, heavy thunderstorm was passing directly over the industrial park, and the aggressive sound of the rain drumming against the massive flat metal roof drowned out almost all the normal background noise of the building. It felt incredibly isolating, like I was trapped inside a concrete bunker. Around 2:30 a.m., I was working 2 aisles over, doing a mandatory system recount in aisle 46. I was trying my best to focus on the numbers displayed on my scanner screen, but my mind kept drifting back to that specific pallet in the other aisle. I finished my row quickly and decided I just needed to walk over and check it, if only for my own peace of mind. As I was walking toward the end of my aisle to loop around the racks, I heard a sound. Even over the heavy, consistent drone of the rain hitting the metal roof high above, the noise was incredibly distinct. It was the deep, harsh scraping noise of heavy wood being dragged forcefully against bare concrete. It was coming directly from aisle 44. My heart immediately started beating much faster in my chest. I froze dead in my tracks, my hand gripping my plastic scanner so tightly my knuckles hurt. The scraping sound lasted for roughly 3 heavy seconds, and then the warehouse went completely still again. I knew for an absolute fact that I was the only inventory employee scheduled on this side of the building tonight. The only other person on the clock was the overnight security guard, and he strictly stayed up front in the main office by the entrance doors. I moved very slowly toward the sharp corner of the metal rack. The concrete floor felt freezing cold through the thick rubber soles of my boots. I carefully leaned my head just past the edge of the shelving to look down the length of aisle 44. The overhead motion lights in the aisle were securely clicked on, bathing the floor in bright, sterile white light. The heavy wooden pallet was pulled far out into the aisle again, but that was not what made me freeze in place. One of the large, heavy mini-fridge boxes had been taken completely off the wooden pallet. It was sitting dead center in the middle of the concrete walkway, placed exactly in the specific path I always take when doing my scheduled inventory rounds. It was positioned perfectly straight, as if it was intentionally waiting for me to arrive. I felt a deep, uncomfortable tightening in my chest. I did not step out into the open aisle. I just stayed hidden near the corner of the rack, trying to logically figure out what I was supposed to do next. Then I noticed something else. The space on the bottom rack where the pallet was supposed to sit was now a dark, empty void. Because the pallet had been pulled so far out into the lit aisle, there was a large gap left behind it, creating a small, shadowed pocket of darkness right underneath the second-tier shelf. From inside that dark, recessed gap, I heard a very soft, shuffling sound. It sounded exactly like heavy fabric brushing slowly against the metal structure of the rack. I stared intensely at the deep shadow beneath the shelf. Slowly, a pale hand reached out from the darkness. Its fingers were long, covered in thick black dirt, and it firmly grasped the rough edge of the wooden pallet. The dirty fingers tightened heavily against the wood. They were trying to pull the pallet back in. They were trying to close the gap they were actively hiding inside. I did not say a single word. I did not yell out to them. I just backed away as quietly as I possibly could, keeping my eyes glued entirely to that hand until I was safely around the corner of the aisle. Once I was completely out of sight, I turned around and sprinted as fast as I could all the way across the massive warehouse toward the front office. I did not stop running until I violently burst through the heavy security door. The guard saw the panicked look on my face and immediately called the local police. I stood behind his desk and told the dispatcher exactly what aisle I was in and exactly what I saw. 4 officers arrived quickly and did a full tactical sweep of Section D with their heavy flashlights drawn. When they finally came back to the front office, the lead officer asked me to show them the exact spot. We walked cautiously back to aisle 44 together. The heavy cardboard box was still sitting right there in the middle of my walking path. The wooden pallet was pushed completely back behind the yellow safety line, looking entirely normal once again. The officers ordered me to stand back, and they pulled the heavy pallet out using a manual hand truck. Behind the first row of boxes, tucked deep into the center of the metal racking, they found an empty space that should have been tightly packed with inventory. Someone had carefully hollowed out a small, hidden cave inside the massive pallet of electronics. Inside that dark space, there was a filthy sleeping bag, a large collection of empty food wrappers stolen from our employee break room, and a large, rusted hunting knife resting right on the cold metal shelf. The police searched the entire warehouse for almost 3 full hours, but the building is just too massive with too many hiding spots. Whoever had been secretly living inside that rack had slipped out through an emergency exit at the very back of the building. The security cameras covering that specific exit door had been manually tilted upward toward the ceiling weeks ago. I quit that job the very next morning. I could not imagine walking down those long, quiet aisles in the dark ever again. Every time I think about that night, I remember that heavy box sitting dead center in my path. It was not a mistake, and it was not a joke. It was a calculated test to see exactly what I would do, to see if I would stop my rounds and try to physically move the box out of the way. If I had bent down to pick up that heavy box in the middle of the aisle, my back would have been completely exposed to that dark gap right under the shelf. What would have happened to me if I had tried to move it? Story 4. I was alone at the elevator in my apartment building, which wasn't unusual, but something about that night just felt different. My name is Elena Voss. I live on the 8th floor of a very tall, older high-rise apartment complex located right in the middle of the downtown area. I work full-time as a bartender at a popular restaurant a few blocks away. Because of the nature of my job, I am usually scheduled for the closing shift. That means I almost never make it back to my apartment building before 1 or 2 in the morning. By the time I walk the short distance from the restaurant to my building, the city streets are usually completely abandoned. There is no traffic, no people walking their dogs, just the low, distant humming of the streetlights. My apartment building has a large, open lobby with a shiny marble floor. It looks nice during the day, but at 2 in the morning it just feels incredibly hollow and empty. Every single footstep I take echoes loudly against the hard walls. There is a small security desk near the front entrance, but the night guard is almost always in the back room, leaving the main lobby entirely deserted. To get to my apartment on the 8th floor, I have to take one of the 2 elevators located at the very back of the lobby. The building is old, and the elevators definitely show their age. They are small, narrow, and move incredibly slow. The walls inside are covered in cheap, fake wood paneling, and the ceiling has a single harsh fluorescent light panel that constantly emits a low, annoying electrical buzz. The most noticeable feature of the elevator, however, is the mirror. The entire back wall of the small cab is covered by a single large sheet of mirrored glass. It is slightly tarnished around the edges from years of heavy use. For as long as I have lived in the building, there has been a very distinct, greasy handprint smudged near the bottom right corner of the glass. The maintenance staff mops the floors regularly, but for some reason, they never seem to wipe that specific smudge away. It was a Tuesday night, right around 1:15 a.m. I had just finished a very long, exhausting shift at the restaurant. My feet were hurting, and all I wanted to do was get upstairs, take my shoes off, and go to sleep. I walked through the empty lobby, pressed the faded-up button on the wall, and waited. A few seconds later, I heard the heavy mechanical grinding of the cables, and the elevator doors slowly slid open. I stepped inside the empty cab and pressed the circular button for the 8th floor. The heavy metal doors closed, sealing me inside the quiet, humming space. I walked toward the back of the elevator and naturally turned around to face the front doors. Because the entire back wall was a mirror, I was standing with my back to the glass, looking directly at the polished metal panels of the closed elevator doors. As the elevator slowly started to rise, I passively stared at my own reflection in the back mirror. I was just adjusting my heavy winter coat and looking at my tired face. But as I looked at the reflection of the small cab behind me, I noticed something strange. In the mirror standing near the very front of the elevator right by the closed doors, there was a dark, blurry shape. It looked exactly like the outline of a tall person wearing a heavy, dark jacket. They were standing perfectly still, tucked tightly into the front corner of the cab. I instantly turned my head and looked toward the front doors. There was absolutely nothing there. The space was completely empty. I was the only person inside the small wooden box. I turned my attention back to the large mirror on the wall, but the dark shape was gone. The reflection just showed the empty space by the doors. I didn't think too much of it at the time. The harsh fluorescent light above me was known to flicker constantly, and the fake wood paneling cast strange, heavy shadows in the corners of the small room. I just assumed my exhausted brain was playing tricks on me after a long shift. When the elevator reached the 8th floor, I walked down the quiet hallway to my apartment, locked my door, and went straight to bed. A few days passed without any other strange incidents. I used the elevator every single day to go down to the lobby for my shift, and it was always completely normal. I slowly forgot about the weird shadow I thought I had seen. Then came Friday night. It was an unusually busy night at the restaurant, and I ended up staying much later than I normally do to help clean up the bar area. By the time I finally walked back to my apartment building, it was almost 2:30 a.m. The air outside was freezing cold, and I was shivering by the time I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby. The lobby was completely dead, just like it always was. I walked straight to the back wall and pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors finally opened, I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 8th floor, and moved toward the back wall. Just like the last time, I turned around to face the front doors, leaning my back slightly against the cold glass of the mirror. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and started scrolling through my text messages, just trying to pass the time during the slow ride up. We passed the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. I briefly looked up from my phone screen and glanced at my reflection in the large mirror behind me. The dark shape was back in the mirror, but this time it was not a blurry shadow standing near the front doors. It was standing directly behind me in the reflection. It was much closer, and the outline was completely clear. It looked like a person completely blacked out, devoid of any features or details, just a solid, heavy mass of darkness. In the reflection, it was standing right over my left shoulder, leaning in slightly, as if it was trying to look down at the screen of my phone. My stomach dropped. The sudden visual of someone standing right behind my back sent a sharp jolt of panic straight to my chest. I spun around on my heels so fast that I almost dropped my phone on the floor. I braced myself, fully expecting to be face to face with an intruder. The elevator was completely empty. I was standing there alone, staring at the blank metal panels of the front doors. There was no one standing behind me. There was no one hiding in the small corners. The only sound in the cab was the low, steady humming of the fluorescent light panel. I felt uneasy. A thin layer of cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I turned to look closely at the large mirror again. The reflection was perfectly normal now. It just showed me standing alone in the center of the small, wood-paneled room. There was no dark figure anywhere. When the elevator finally reached the 8th floor and the doors slid open, I practically ran out into the hallway. I didn't look back at the mirror. I power-walked down the long, carpeted corridor, constantly checking over my shoulder until I was safely inside my locked apartment. I double-checked the deadbolt and made sure every single window was locked. For the next few days, I strongly considered taking the stairs, but walking up 8 full flights of concrete stairs at 2 in the morning after a brutal 9-hour shift just wasn't physically possible for me. I tried to rationalize the experience. I told myself it was just a severe trick of the lighting, combined with extreme sleep deprivation. I desperately wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. The third incident happened the following Wednesday night. It was raining heavily outside, and my coat was completely soaked by the time I made it back to the building lobby. I was tired, cold, and just wanted to take a hot shower. I approached the elevator bank and pressed the button. When the heavy doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the 8. This time I decided I was going to prove to myself that everything was fine. I wasn't going to lean against the mirror and let my imagination run wild in the background. I walked directly to the front of the elevator, right up to the closed metal doors. I turned completely around so I was facing the back wall. I stood there, staring directly into the large mirror, watching my own reflection intently. The elevator slowly lurched upward. I watched the wet rain dripping off my coat in the mirror. I focused strictly on my own tired face, determined not to let the shadows play tricks on me. We passed the 3rd floor, then the 4th, then the 5th. Right as we passed the 6th floor, the dark figure appeared again. It didn't fade in slowly. It was just suddenly there, standing directly behind my right shoulder in the reflection. It was so close that if it were real, I should have been able to feel the cold air radiating off its dark mass. I should have heard it breathing in the small, quiet space. I didn't spin around this time. I was completely paralyzed. I just stayed facing forward, staring wide-eyed into the large mirror. I watched the dark, featureless shape hovering right behind me. Something felt off. The air inside the small wooden cab felt incredibly dense, almost suffocating. My hands were shaking at my sides, but I refused to break eye contact with the mirror. Then the unthinkable happened. The reflection in the mirror shifted on its own. I was standing perfectly still, completely frozen in fear. My hands were planted firmly against my sides, but in the mirror the dark figure slowly began to move. It raised a long, shadowy arm up toward the glass. I watched in absolute disbelief as the reflection did something completely independent of reality. The dark figure extended its shadowy hand downward, reaching specifically toward the bottom right corner of the large mirror. I watched its dark fingers slowly trace the edge of the glass, moving directly over that old, greasy handprint smudge that had been there for years. The figure pressed its dark palm flat against the smudge, pressing into the glass from the inside of the reflection. Right at that exact moment, the elevator jerked to a stop. A loud, mechanical clunk echoed through the small cab, and the heavy metal doors slid open directly behind me. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I threw myself backward, stumbling blindly out of the elevator and into the safety of the 8th floor hallway. I landed hard on the carpeted floor, instantly scrambling to my feet. I didn't turn my back on the open elevator. I stood in the middle of the hallway, breathing heavily, just watching the large mirror inside the cab. The dark figure was completely gone. The reflection was entirely normal again, just showing the empty wooden walls and the harsh fluorescent light. A few seconds later, the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing the empty cab away. I heard the mechanical grinding start up again as the elevator slowly descended back down to the lobby. I have absolutely no idea what I saw in that mirror, and I refuse to ever find out. Since that night, I have never stepped foot inside that elevator again. I force myself to walk up 8 painful flights of concrete stairs every single night after work, no matter how tired or sore my feet are. It takes me an extra 10 minutes, but it is entirely worth the peace of mind. Because sometimes, when I walk past the elevator bank in the lobby, I can see my reflection in the polished metal doors. And I always wonder if that dark figure is still in there, waiting just on the other side of the glass. Whose handprint is really on that mirror? Story 5. It was the first night I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Everett Dane. Earlier this year, I finally saved up enough money to move out of a cramped, noisy apartment complex and rent a small, single-story house on the very edge of town. It was a quiet, isolated street with only a few other houses scattered around. My property backed up against a thick line of tall pine trees. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to listen to neighbors arguing through thin walls or heavy footsteps stomping on the ceiling above me. The house was older, built sometime in the late 70s. It had a large living room with a massive front window that faced the dark street. Because the house was so quiet, you could hear every little creaking shift of the floorboards and the constant, rhythmic clicking sound of the old ceiling fan in the living room. It was a Friday night in late November. The weather outside was bitterly cold, so I had all the windows shut tight and the heater running low. It was right around 11:30 p.m. I was sitting comfortably on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, just watching a documentary on my television. The volume was turned down low so I wouldn't disturb the peaceful atmosphere of the house. I was completely relaxed, enjoying the isolation. Then my cell phone started vibrating aggressively on the wooden coffee table. I picked up the phone and looked at the bright screen. It just said unknown number. I usually never answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, assuming they are just automated spam or wrong numbers. But I had recently submitted a maintenance request to my landlord regarding a slow leak under the kitchen sink. I thought maybe he was calling late from a different phone to schedule a repair for the morning. I swiped the screen to accept the call and brought the phone up to my ear. I said hello in a completely normal, tired voice. There was no immediate response. I waited a few seconds and said hello again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. But the line wasn't dead. I could hear a very faint, steady sound coming through the small speaker. It took my brain a second to register exactly what it was. It sounded like someone breathing very softly. It was a slow, deliberate sound. I felt a slight twinge of annoyance, assuming it was just some local kids making prank calls late at night. I told them it wasn't funny and hung up the phone. I tossed it back onto the coffee table and went back to watching my documentary. The rest of the night passed without any other interruptions. I went to sleep, completely forgetting about the weird phone call by the time I woke up the next morning. I spent my Saturday doing completely normal things. I went to the grocery store, cleaned the house, and did some laundry. By the time evening rolled around, the house was dark and quiet again. I made myself dinner and eventually ended up right back in my exact same spot on the living room couch. It was getting late again. I glanced at the digital clock on my television screen. It was almost exactly 11:30 p.m. Right as I read the numbers, my cell phone started vibrating on the coffee table. The sudden buzzing noise made me jump slightly. I leaned forward and picked it up. The bright screen displayed the exact same words from the night before, unknown number. Something felt off. A very slight, uncomfortable tension settled in the back of my neck. It was strange enough to get a silent breathing call once, but to get the exact same call at the exact same time the very next night felt incredibly intentional. I sat there watching the phone vibrate in my hand for several seconds. I honestly debated just putting it on silent and ignoring it entirely, but human curiosity is a strong, powerful thing. I wanted to know who was on the other end of the line. I swiped to answer and slowly pressed the phone against my ear. This time I didn't say a single word. I just sat perfectly still in the quiet living room and listened. At first there was only the faint static of the cellular connection. Then the sound slowly faded in. It was the soft, steady breathing again, but it was much louder tonight. It sounded clearer, like the person had moved the phone's microphone much closer to their face. I sat there in the dim light of the television, just listening to the rhythmic sound. It was a very calm, measured pace of inhaling and exhaling. I didn't want to speak and give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I just kept the phone pressed tightly to my ear. As I sat there breathing quietly in my quiet house, I started to notice a strange pattern. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a heavy physical weight. The breathing coming through the phone wasn't just random. It was perfectly, flawlessly synchronized with my own. Every single time my chest rose and I inhaled, the quiet, raspy sound on the phone drew in a breath. Every time my chest fell and I exhaled, the sound on the phone exhaled. The timing was entirely perfect. There was no delay. It was a complete mirror reflection of my own physical rhythm. I felt uneasy. I tried to convince myself that there was a logical, technological explanation. I told myself it must be some sort of weird audio feedback loop. Maybe my phone's microphone was picking up the sound of my own breath, sending it through the network and echoing it right back into my ear speaker. It seemed like a massive stretch, but I desperately needed to believe it wasn't a real person. I decided I had to test it to know for sure. I took a very sudden, incredibly sharp breath in through my nose. It was quick and unnatural. The exact millisecond I did it, a sudden, sharp intake of air came clearly through the phone. It matched my sudden movement perfectly. It didn't sound like a digital echo. It sounded distinctly human. My hands started to sweat against the smooth plastic of my phone case. I needed to do one final test to prove exactly what was happening. I took a normal, steady breath in. Then I closed my mouth tightly and completely stopped breathing. I held the air firmly in my lungs and did not make a single sound. The breathing on the phone stopped instantly. The line went completely, heavily silent. I sat frozen on my couch, my eyes wide, staring blankly at the dark television screen. 10 seconds slowly ticked by in absolute silence. I didn't exhale. The person on the phone didn't exhale. We were locked in a completely silent, terrifying standoff over the cellular network. 15 seconds passed. My chest started to burn slightly, demanding oxygen. I couldn't hold it any longer. I slowly, carefully let the air escape through my nose in a long, quiet exhale. The very moment I did, a slow, raspy exhale came clearly through the phone speaker. The illusion of a technical glitch was completely shattered. The sound quality was vastly different from my own breath. It sounded thick and wet. But it was the faint sound in the background of their audio that truly terrified me. Behind the raspy breathing, I heard a very distinct rhythmic noise. It was a slow, mechanical sound. I heard a steady, familiar clicking noise in the background of their audio. I slowly lifted my head and looked up at the ceiling of my living room. The old wooden ceiling fan was spinning lazily above me, making that exact same quiet, rhythmic clicking sound. The noise coming through the phone matched it perfectly in time and pitch. Whoever was on the other end of the line was not calling from far away. They were incredibly close. They were close enough to hear the faint mechanical clicking of the ceiling fan inside my own living room. I slowly turned my head and looked at the massive, uncovered front window just a few feet away from my couch. The street outside was pitch black. The window was basically a giant, dark mirror. I didn't say a word. I lowered the phone from my ear and quietly placed it face down on the couch cushion. I didn't even hang up the call. I slid off the couch, dropping down to my hands and knees on the carpet. I stayed incredibly low to the ground, completely out of sight of the large glass window. I crawled as fast and as quietly as I could out of the living room and into the dark hallway. Once I was safely behind the solid wall of the hallway, I stood up and quickly checked the deadbolt on the front door. It was locked. I crept into my bedroom, grabbed my spare work phone from the nightstand, and immediately dialed 911. I kept my voice down to an absolute whisper, telling the dispatcher that someone was actively prowling right outside the windows of my house. 2 police cruisers arrived at my property about 12 minutes later. I saw the flash of their bright blue and red lights sweep across my bedroom wall. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and let the officers inside. I explained the entire situation, showing them my personal cell phone, which was still sitting on the couch. The call had eventually disconnected on its own. The officers went outside with heavy, bright flashlights to search the entire perimeter of the house. When they finally came back inside, their expressions were incredibly serious. They asked me to step outside and look at something. I followed them out the front door and walked over to the large living room window. Right beneath the glass, clearly visible in the soft dirt of the flower bed, were 2 deep sets of heavy boot prints. Someone had been standing directly outside my window, leaning in close enough to hear the ceiling fan, watching me sitting alone on my couch in the dark. The police took a full report and promised to increase patrols in my quiet neighborhood, but they admitted there wasn't much else they could do without a description or a suspect. I spent the entire next day buying and installing thick, heavy blackout curtains for every single window in the house. I keep them pulled completely shut at all times, even during the bright daylight hours. It has been over 3 weeks since that night. I still live in the house because I signed a rigid 12-month lease, but the peaceful isolation I originally wanted feels entirely suffocating now. I never answered another call from that strange, unknown number. I completely blocked it in my phone settings. But my phone still vibrates. Almost every single night, right around 11:30 p.m., the screen lights up brightly in the dark living room. The call comes through from a completely new, spoofed number every time. I just sit completely still on the couch, watching the phone buzz aggressively on the wooden coffee table until it eventually goes to voicemail. I try my absolute hardest to keep my breathing as quiet and as shallow as possible. I don't want to make a single sound. Because even with the heavy curtains drawn tight, I still get that horrible, sinking feeling that someone is standing just inches away on the other side of the glass, waiting patiently for my chest to rise. How did they know exactly when I stopped breathing? Story 6. It was around the 2nd week of the neighbor's routine when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Leora Kessler. I live in a massive, outdated apartment complex located on the outer edge of the city. My specific building is shaped like a giant rectangle, with long, narrow hallways that seem to stretch on forever. I live on the 4th floor, right at the very dead end of the corridor. Because of the awkward layout of the building, there are only 2 doors positioned at that far wall. There is my door, apartment 412, and the door situated directly across the narrow hall from me, apartment 413. Living at the dead end usually means you get a lot of peace and quiet. You never have people walking past your door carrying heavy groceries or loud kids running down the hall to get to the stairwell. It is just you and whoever happens to live across from you. The hallway itself is incredibly dull. The maintenance staff uses cheap fluorescent bulbs that cast a sickly, yellowish hue over the ugly floral carpet, which is thick enough to muffle almost any footsteps. For the first few months of my lease, I honestly thought apartment 413 was completely empty. I never saw anyone moving furniture in, I never bumped into anyone locking the door, and I never heard a television playing through the walls. The heavy wooden door remained firmly shut at all times. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, which means my sleep schedule is completely irregular. I usually stay up very late into the night working on my laptop. I prefer to work sitting on my living room couch, which is positioned in a way that gives me a direct line of sight to my front entryway. It was a Tuesday night and the building was incredibly quiet. The only sound in my apartment was the low, steady humming of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was getting very late, right around 2:15 a.m. As I was staring closely at a design on my computer screen, I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It was a heavy, metallic sliding noise. It sounded exactly like the thick metal deadbolt of a door being manually unlocked. I stopped typing immediately and just listened. A second later, I heard the heavy wooden door across the hall pull open. The old hinges made a very slow, tight groaning sound in the quiet corridor. I thought it was slightly odd for someone to be leaving their apartment at 2:15 in the morning on a random weekday. I quietly set my laptop on the coffee table, stood up from the couch, and walked over to my front door. I pressed my eye against the small glass peephole to look out into the bright, fluorescent-lit hallway. The door to apartment 413 wasn't wide open. It was only cracked open about 2 or 3 inches. I could just barely see the dark vertical line of the gap from my angle. The apartment inside was completely pitch black. There was no hallway light turned on, no glowing screen, just heavy, absolute darkness spilling out into the crack. I stood there watching the dark gap, fully expecting someone to walk out into the hall and head toward the elevator. But no one did. Exactly 5 seconds later, the heavy door smoothly clicked shut. I heard the loud, metallic sliding sound of the deadbolt locking from the inside. I shrugged it off. I assumed they just wanted to check the hallway for a late package delivery, or maybe they heard a noise outside and were just being cautious. I walked back to my couch and went right back to work. The next night, I was sitting in the exact same spot on my couch. The building was just as quiet and isolated as always. I was deeply focused on adjusting the colors of a project when I heard that same heavy, metallic sliding noise echo from the hallway. I quickly looked over at the bright digital clock on my microwave. It was exactly 2:15 a.m. I felt a very slight twinge of curiosity. I stood up, walked quietly over to my front door, and looked through the peephole again. Just like the night before, the door to 413 was cracked open about 2 inches. The space inside was completely dark. I watched the thin black line, and I started counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The door clicked shut, and the deadbolt forcefully slid back into place. Something felt off. It was just too precise. Opening a door to check the hallway once is entirely normal, but doing it at the exact same minute, for the exact same amount of time, 2 nights in a row, felt incredibly calculated. It didn't feel like a random check. It felt like a rigid, strict routine. By the time Friday rolled around, the routine had become a terrifyingly consistent pattern. Every single night without fail, the heavy deadbolt would slide open at exactly 2:15 a.m. The door would crack open for exactly 5 seconds, revealing nothing but a pitch-black apartment, and then it would close and lock again. I started losing focus on my design work. I would just sit perfectly still on my couch around 2 in the morning, staring across the living room at my own front door, waiting anxiously for the metallic sliding sound. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why were they doing it? Were they looking for something specific? Were they looking for someone? The most unsettling part to me was the complete lack of light. If you get out of bed in the middle of the night to check your front door, you almost always turn on a lamp, or at the very least, use the flashlight on your cell phone. But whoever lived in 413 was navigating their apartment in absolute, blinding darkness. By the start of the second week, my casual curiosity had completely morphed into a deep, uncomfortable paranoia. I felt uneasy every single time I walked past their door during the day to check my mail or take out the trash. I found myself staring at the cheap brass numbers nailed to the wood, constantly wondering who was standing on the other side. I decided I needed to know what was going on. I couldn't keep sitting in my living room every night, wondering if a stranger was silently watching my door through that 2-inch gap. It was a Sunday night. At 2:10 a.m., I shut my laptop and turned off every single light in my apartment. I walked over to my front door and stood there in the dark entryway. I placed my hand firmly on my own deadbolt, resting my thumb gently over the locking mechanism. I pressed my eye against the peephole and waited. The hallway outside was perfectly still. The thick floral carpet soaked up all the ambient sound of the sleeping building. At exactly 2:15 a.m., I heard the familiar metallic sliding noise from across the hall. I saw the brass knob on their door slowly turn, and the heavy wood pulled inward, creating that familiar 2-inch gap of deep blackness. My heart started beating much faster in my chest. Instead of just passively watching through the glass, I decided to test the routine. I gripped my own deadbolt and quickly twisted it open. The lock made a loud, sharp click. I grabbed my doorknob, pulled my door inward just an inch, and put my face near the crack, looking directly across the narrow hallway at their open door. I waited for the 5 seconds to pass. I fully expected their door to click shut immediately, just like it always did. But it didn't. 10 seconds went by in complete silence, then 20. The door to 413 remained cracked open. My stomach dropped. The rigid routine was broken. They hadn't closed the door because they heard my deadbolt unlock in the quiet hall. They knew I was standing there, looking right back at them. The hallway was dead silent. I held my breath, terrified to make a single sound. I kept my eyes glued to the dark gap across the hall. Very slowly, the door to 413 began to open wider. It didn't swing open smoothly. It moved in slow, calculated increments. The 2-inch gap became 6 inches, then a foot. Then the heavy door was resting wide open, completely exposing the interior of the apartment to the hallway. The darkness inside was incredibly thick. The bright fluorescent light from the corridor seemed to just stop at their threshold, refusing to illuminate anything inside their entryway. I strained my eyes, looking desperately for a silhouette, a reflection, anything that proved a normal human being was standing there. But the entryway was entirely empty. Then I heard a sound coming from deep inside the pitch-black apartment. It sounded like heavy bare feet shuffling very slowly against a hard linoleum floor. The sound was distinct, and it was moving closer to the open doorway. It was a deliberate, dragging pace. I was completely paralyzed. I watched the edge of the wooden doorframe, waiting for someone to step out into the bright light. The shuffling sound stopped right at the very edge of the darkness. From the absolute black of the apartment, a single, pale hand reached out and grabbed the outer edge of the wooden doorframe. The fingers were long, incredibly thin, and entirely devoid of color. They gripped the painted wood so tightly that the knuckles turned completely white. Whoever it was didn't step out into the hall. They just stood there, hidden perfectly in the dark, gripping the frame, waiting patiently for me to open my door wider. I didn't hesitate for another second. I slammed my door shut as hard as I physically could and violently twisted the deadbolt back into the locked position. I backed away from the door quickly, my hands shaking uncontrollably, until my back hit the far wall of my living room. I stood there in the dark for hours, just listening. I never heard the heavy hinges of their door close. I never heard their deadbolt slide back into place. The next morning, when I finally found the courage to unlock my door and leave for work, the door to 413 was shut tightly, looking completely normal. I haven't opened my door in the middle of the night since. I installed an extra heavy-duty chain lock and shoved a thick bookshelf against the wall near the entryway, but the pattern hasn't stopped. Every single night, right at 2:15 a.m., I hear that heavy metallic sliding noise echo from across the hall. I know the door is opening. I know they are standing there in the dark. Why did their door only stay open longer when I finally opened mine? Story 7. When I first arrived at the hotel, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Bryce Halden. I work as a regional auditor for a large retail company, which means I spend the vast majority of my time on the road. I'm incredibly used to driving long hours, eating fast food in my car, and sleeping in generic roadside hotels. Because my company pays for my travel expenses, they usually book me in mid-range chain hotels right off the interstate exits. They are never luxurious, but they are usually clean and quiet enough to get a decent night of sleep. It was a Tuesday in late October. I had just finished a brutal 8-hour drive across the state and was feeling completely exhausted. I pulled into the massive, mostly empty parking lot of the hotel right around 5 p.m. The sky was already starting to get dark and the air was cold. I grabbed my small overnight duffel bag from the passenger seat, locked my car, and walked inside to the front desk. The lobby was completely dead. It smelled strongly of artificial lemon cleaner and old coffee. The clerk behind the counter looked just as tired as I felt. He barely said a word to me as he checked my ID, handed me a plastic keycard, and pointed me toward the elevators. I was assigned to room 418. I rode the slow, softly humming elevator up to the 4th floor. When the metal door slid open, I stepped out into a very long, very straight corridor. The walls were painted a plain, dull beige, and the floor was covered in a dark, heavily patterned carpet that was clearly designed to hide years of heavy foot traffic. The fluorescent lights overhead were dim, creating long shadows down the length of the hall. As I started walking down the corridor to find my room, I noticed a large housekeeping cart parked neatly against the right wall. It was situated near the very beginning of the hallway, sitting right outside room 402. It looked exactly like every other hotel cleaning cart I had ever seen. It had a thick gray plastic frame, with 3 large shelves stacked high with folded white towels, small bottles of cheap shampoo, and spare rolls of toilet paper. Attached to the front was a clear plastic bag used for gathering trash. Hanging off the back end was a massive, thick blue canvas bag, which the staff used to collect dirty bed sheets and used linens from the rooms. I didn't think twice about it. I walked right past the cart, found room 418 near the very end of the long hallway, swiped my keycard, and went inside. I dropped my bag on the bed, took a hot shower, and turned on the television just to have some background noise in the quiet room. Around 7:30 p.m., I realized I was incredibly thirsty. I grabbed my plastic ice bucket from the small desk and decided to walk down the hall to the vending area near the elevators. I pulled open my heavy wooden door and stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was completely silent. There were no sounds of televisions playing through the walls, no muffled conversations, and no heavy doors opening or closing. I started walking toward the elevators, and that was when I noticed the cart again. It had moved. It was no longer sitting at the far end of the hallway by room 402. It was now parked perfectly parallel to the wall right outside room 412. It was significantly closer to my room. I thought it was a little strange. Housekeeping usually finished their daily rounds by mid-afternoon. It was incredibly rare to see staff cleaning standard rooms this late in the evening. I glanced around the dim hallway, fully expecting to see a maid stepping out of a nearby room with an armful of dirty towels, but the corridor was completely empty. I listened closely, trying to hear the muffled sound of a vacuum cleaner or the running water of a shower being scrubbed, but there was nothing, total silence. I just shrugged it off, assuming a worker was taking a quick break in a supply closet or had just left the cart behind to grab something from downstairs. I walked past it, filled my bucket at the loud, grinding ice machine, and walked back to my room. The cart was still sitting there, completely untouched. By 10:15 p.m., I was getting hungry. I didn't want to leave the building, so I just used an app on my phone to order some food from a nearby diner. I requested that the driver just leave the bag right outside my door so I wouldn't have to interact with anyone. About 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a notification telling me my food had been delivered. I got off the bed, walked over to my front door, and pulled the metal handle. When the heavy door swung open, I looked down to grab my paper bag of food. But as I stood back up, my eyes naturally drifted down the length of the dark hallway. My stomach dropped. The cleaning cart was now parked directly outside room 416. It was literally the very next door down from mine. I stepped fully out into the hallway, leaving my own door propped open with my foot. The silence in the hotel felt incredibly heavy now. There was absolutely no reason for that cart to be moving down the hall this late at night. It was almost 11. There was no housekeeping staff on duty. I stared closely at the cart. Nothing on the shelves had been touched. The stacks of clean white towels were perfectly folded. The small bottles of shampoo were still lined up in neat rows. But as my eyes moved to the back of the cart, I noticed something about the thick blue canvas laundry bag. It was completely full. The heavy blue fabric was stretched tight, bulging outward in strange, rigid angles. It looked incredibly heavy, resting firmly on the bottom plastic base of the cart. Something felt off. A deep, unsettling tension settled in the center of my chest. I quickly reached down, grabbed my bag of food, and stepped backward into my room. I shut the heavy wooden door forcefully and immediately engaged the thick metal deadbolt. I even reached up and flipped the secondary metal security latch into place. I tried to rationalize the entire situation while I ate my food. I told myself it was just a night shift maintenance worker doing some sort of weird inventory, or maybe a security guard using the cart to move something heavy down the hall. I desperately wanted to believe there was a normal, logical explanation for why that cart was slowly creeping toward my room. I eventually turned off the television and forced myself to go to sleep right around midnight. The room was pitch black, and the heating unit under the window kept clicking on and off, creating a steady rhythm that helped me drift off. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, but the room was freezing cold. I rolled over and looked at the glowing red numbers on the digital alarm clock sitting on the nightstand. It was 2:30 a.m. I was about to close my eyes again when I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It was a slow, repetitive squeaking noise. It sounded exactly like heavy plastic wheels turning sluggishly over a thick carpet. With every rotation of the wheels, I could hear a very faint, secondary sound. It was a soft, rattling noise, like small plastic bottles gently clinking against each other. I froze in my bed, holding my breath. The sound was moving. It was slowly rolling down the hallway, getting progressively louder with every single passing second. Squeak, rattle, squeak, rattle. It was the cart. Someone was pushing the cart down the dark hallway in the middle of the night. I felt uneasy. I lay perfectly still under the covers, just listening as the slow, heavy rolling sound approached my wall. I waited for it to roll past my door and continue down the hall toward the dead end. But it didn't pass my door. The slow squeaking sound came to a complete stop right outside my room. I waited for several long, agonizing minutes in the dark, but there were no other sounds. No footsteps walking away. No doors opening, just a heavy, suffocating silence right on the other side of my wall. I slowly pulled the covers off my body and placed my bare feet on the cold carpet. I didn't turn on any lights. I walked as silently as I possibly could across the dark hotel room until I was standing mere inches away from my locked front door. My hands were shaking slightly at my sides. I carefully leaned my head forward and pressed my right eye flush against the small glass peephole to look out into the corridor. I couldn't see the hallway. The curved glass lens was completely blocked. All I could see was a wall of thick, dark blue fabric pressed directly against the outside of my door. The cart had been pushed perfectly horizontal, completely barricading my exit. The massive canvas laundry bag was resting firmly against the painted wood of my door. I backed away from the peephole, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Whoever had pushed the cart there was trying to trap me inside. Or worse, they wanted me to open the door to see why my path was blocked. As I stood there staring at the heavy wood, I heard a new sound. It wasn't the squeak of the wheels or the rattling of bottles. It was a slow, deliberate shifting noise. It sounded exactly like heavy fabric rubbing together. The sound wasn't coming from behind the cart. It was coming from directly inside the blue canvas laundry bag. Something inside that bag was actively moving. I didn't wait another second. I practically ran to the nightstand, grabbed the hotel phone, and immediately dialed the front desk. The phone rang 5 times before the tired clerk finally answered. I kept my voice to a harsh whisper, telling him that someone had barricaded my door with a cleaning cart and that there was someone hiding inside of it. He sounded incredibly confused, but he promised to send the overnight security guard up to the 4th floor immediately. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the locked door, listening to the faint, continuous shifting sounds coming from the heavy canvas bag outside. It took exactly 8 minutes for the elevator to chime at the end of the hall. I heard heavy, authoritative footsteps marching down the corridor. Then, I heard the loud, harsh scraping sound of the plastic cart being forcefully yanked away from my door. "Security," a deep voice called out, accompanied by 3 loud knocks on my door. "It's clear, you can open up." I cautiously unlatched the security lock, flipped the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. A tall, serious-looking security guard was standing in the hallway, holding a heavy maglite flashlight. The cart was pushed awkwardly against the opposite wall. The guard looked at me and sighed, apologizing for the inconvenience. He told me it was probably just some drunk teenagers pulling a stupid prank by moving the cart around the halls. He assured me the hallway was completely empty when he got off the elevator. But as I looked past the guard and stared at the cleaning cart, my stomach dropped all over again. The thick blue canvas laundry bag was completely empty now. It hung loosely from the plastic frame, looking flat and deflated, but that wasn't what scared me. Right in the center of the heavy blue fabric, starting from the bottom and running almost all the way to the top, was a massive, jagged tear. The thick material hadn't just ripped under heavy weight. The edges of the fabric were clean and sharp. It had been sliced completely open from the inside out. I packed my bags and demanded to be moved to the first floor right next to the lobby for the rest of the night. I never found out who pushed that cart down the hallway, and the hotel management refused to show me any of the security footage from the fourth floor. I still travel a lot for work, but I refuse to ever sleep in a room near the end of a long hallway. Every time I walk past a housekeeping cart in a hotel, I can't help but stare at those thick canvas laundry bags. What exactly was hiding inside that bag? Story 8. I used to go on late-night jogs during the summer. One night, I realized someone else had been walking the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Taran Salas. I live by myself in a small, quiet suburban town. I work long hours as a medical receptionist at a busy clinic, which means I spend almost my entire day sitting behind a desk, staring at a computer screen. By the time I get home, eat dinner, and unwind, it is usually pretty late. Because I need to burn off the restless energy from sitting all day, I have a strict habit of going for a run every single night right around 11 p.m. My neighborhood is incredibly safe and mostly consists of older families and retired couples. By 10 o'clock, almost every house is completely dark, with only the faint glow of porch lights illuminating the sidewalks. My usual jogging route is exactly 3.5 miles. It is a very simple, repetitive loop. I start at my apartment complex, jog down a long, tree-lined residential street, take a sharp right at the local elementary school, follow the long chain-link fence that wraps around the playground, and then loop back up the main avenue to my building. Because I run this exact same route every single night, my body just knows it by muscle memory. I know exactly which sidewalk squares are raised by overgrown tree roots. I know exactly which streetlights have been burnt out for months. It is a very peaceful, predictable routine. It was a Tuesday night in the middle of July when I first noticed the person. The air was thick and humid. I was about a mile into my run, just approaching the long stretch of sidewalk that runs parallel to the elementary school's tall chain-link fence. As I rounded the corner by the main office, I looked down the long, straight concrete path ahead of me. About 1.5 blocks away, passing under the glow of a flickering amber streetlight, I saw a figure. It was just a tall person wearing dark clothing, walking in the exact same direction I was heading. I didn't think much of it at first. It isn't entirely unusual to see someone walking their dog or taking a late stroll in my neighborhood during the warmer months. I kept my steady jogging pace, fully expecting to catch up to them and pass them on the wide sidewalk within a few minutes. But I didn't. After about 10 minutes of continuous jogging along the fence line, I realized the distance between us hadn't changed at all. They were still exactly 1.5 blocks ahead of me. That meant whoever it was had to be walking at an incredibly fast, unnatural pace just to stay ahead of my running speed. I watched them take the left turn onto the main avenue right before I did. By the time I reached that same corner and turned, they were already gone, swallowed up by the heavy shadows of the large oak trees. I just shrugged it off, assuming they had turned into one of the nearby houses. 2 nights later, on Thursday, the weather was much cooler. I left my apartment at 11 p.m. sharp and started my normal loop. I felt great, keeping a really solid, even pace down the residential street. I reached the corner of the elementary school, took the sharp right turn, and looked down the long stretch of sidewalk bordering the chain-link fence. My stomach dropped slightly. The figure was there again. They were in the exact same spot, under the exact same flickering amber streetlight, 1.5 blocks ahead of me. They were wearing a heavy, dark hoodie with the hood pulled up tightly over their head, which made absolutely no sense for a summer night. I kept jogging, keeping my eyes locked on their back. Just like before, the distance between us remained perfectly constant. I was running and they were just walking, but I couldn't close the gap. I started to really pay attention to the way they moved. It was a very stiff, rigid walk. Their arms didn't swing naturally at their sides. They just hung straight down, completely motionless, while their legs moved at that impossibly fast pace. Something felt off. A very slight feeling of unease settled in the back of my mind. I watched them take the final left turn onto the main avenue. When I finally reached that same turn a minute later, the long street was completely empty. They had vanished again. I spent the entire day at work on Friday trying to convince myself it was just a strange coincidence. It was a public sidewalk. Maybe someone else just had the same late-night exercise schedule as me and naturally walked fast. But the rigid way they moved and the heavy dark hoodie kept bothering me. I decided I was going to test it. I was going to change my route. Friday night at 11 p.m., I stepped out of my apartment building. I jogged down the initial residential street, but when I reached the elementary school, I didn't take the right turn. I completely ignored the chain-link fence section. Instead, I took a sharp left, heading down a dark, narrow street that I never, ever used. It was a dead-end road that only connected back to the main avenue through a small, unlit dirt alleyway between two brick houses. I felt a slight sense of relief as I jogged down the unfamiliar street. It was pitch black, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic thud of my running shoes hitting the asphalt. I reached the end of the road and turned into the narrow dirt alleyway. I looked ahead toward the exit of the alley, where it met the main avenue. Standing directly under the streetlight at the end of the dirt path, facing away from me, was the figure in the dark hoodie. They were exactly a block and a half ahead. They hadn't just stumbled onto my new route, they had anticipated it. They had somehow bypassed the school completely and positioned themselves perfectly ahead of me in a dark alley they couldn't have possibly known I was going to take. I felt completely sick. I stopped jogging immediately. I just planted my feet firmly on the dirt path and stood completely still. The second my shoes stopped making noise, the figure stopped walking. They froze dead in their tracks at the very end of the alley. They didn't take another step forward. They just stood there, a tall, dark silhouette illuminated by the harsh orange glow of the streetlight. The silence in the alley was suffocating. I could hear my own heavy breathing echoing in the narrow space between the brick houses. I stared at the back of their dark hood. They didn't turn around. They didn't look over their shoulder to see why I had stopped. They just stood perfectly rigid, facing the empty street ahead. I needed to know if they were actually reacting to me, or if they had just stopped for a random reason. My hands were shaking slightly at my sides. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of my shoe crunching softly against the dry dirt echoed in the quiet alley. Instantly, the figure took one slow, deliberate step forward. I felt a tight knot form in my throat. I took 2 quick steps backward, retreating deeper into the heavy shadows of the alley. The figure took 2 quick steps backward. It was a perfect, flawless mirror of my movements. They weren't just walking the same route. They were actively matching me, dictating the exact distance between us, keeping me perfectly isolated behind them. They were acting like a shadow completely detached from my body. A sudden, overwhelming urge to run washed over me, but not forward. I turned completely around, facing the dark dead-end street I had just come from, and I sprinted as fast as I physically could. I didn't jog, I ran with absolutely everything I had. The sound of my own desperate footsteps was incredibly loud in the quiet neighborhood. But as I sprinted down the middle of the dark street, I heard a new sound. It was coming from directly behind me. It was the heavy, rhythmic scuffing of shoes hitting the pavement. It wasn't the sound of someone running. It was the sound of someone power walking at a terrifying, inhuman speed, matching my full sprint stride for stride. I didn't dare look back. I knew that if I turned my head and saw them right behind me, I would trip and fall. I just focused on the streetlights ahead, pushing my legs harder than I ever had in my entire life. My lungs were burning, but I didn't slow down. I flew past the elementary school, cutting across the wet grass of the lawns, completely abandoning the paved sidewalks. The heavy scuffing sound stayed right behind me the entire way. It never got closer, but it never faded away. It stayed exactly a block and a half behind me, perfectly matching my panicked pace. I finally reached my apartment building. I pulled my keys from my pocket while I was still running, practically throwing my body against the heavy glass lobby doors. I burst inside, ran up the 2 flights of concrete stairs to my floor, and threw myself into my apartment. I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, and latched the heavy metal security chain. I stood in my dark entryway for almost 20 minutes, just leaning my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. The silence of my apartment slowly returned, replacing the sound of my pounding heart. When I could finally breathe normally again, I slowly walked over to my living room window. My apartment faces the street, giving me a clear view of the wide sidewalk directly below. I parted the vertical blinds just a tiny fraction of an inch and looked down. Standing directly across the street, perfectly centered under a flickering streetlight, was the figure. They were just standing there on the concrete, their hands hanging stiffly at their sides, the dark hood pulled up to hide their face. But they weren't facing down the street anymore. They were standing perfectly still, facing directly up at my 4th floor window. I haven't gone for a late-night jog since that night. I bought a cheap treadmill and put it in my living room. I keep my blinds permanently drawn shut, and I make sure my front door is always securely locked before the sun even goes down. The police couldn't do anything because no actual crime was committed, and I couldn't even give them a basic physical description of a face. But sometimes, when it gets late, I just sit on my couch and stare at the closed blinds, thinking about that dark alleyway. I think about the rigid way they moved and the impossible speed they walked at just to keep me behind them. Why did they never turn around to look at me? Story 9. I had been to the basement laundry room plenty of times before, and nothing ever happened until that night. My name is Colby Renwick. I live in a large, older apartment building on the west side of the city. I work late hours managing a warehouse, so I usually don't get back to my apartment until well after midnight. By the time I shower, eat a quick meal, and actually start winding down, it is normally pushing 2 a.m. because of my weird schedule. I am forced to do all my household chores in the dead of night. This includes doing my laundry. Building's laundry room is not a very welcoming place. It is a large, rectangular space located entirely underground in the basement. It has bare concrete floors, thick exposed pipes running across the low ceiling, and harsh fluorescent lights that constantly flicker. Along the left wall is a row of 6 heavy-duty washing machines, and along the right wall are the dryers. At the very back of the room, tucked away in the darkest corner, is a heavy wooden door that leads to the building's main boiler room. Getting to the laundry room requires walking down a narrow flight of concrete stairs and pushing through a massive metal fire door. When that fire door swings shut behind you, it completely cuts off all sound from the rest of the building. It feels incredibly isolated down there, but I never really minded the quiet. I preferred doing my laundry at 2 a.m. because the machines were always empty and I didn't have to deal with my neighbors. It was a Tuesday night and the building was completely silent. I gathered my dirty clothes into a plastic basket, grabbed my detergent, and walked down the concrete stairs. I pushed open the heavy fire door and stepped into the cold basement. It was completely empty. I walked over to washing machine number 4, threw my clothes inside, poured in the soap, and shut the heavy metal lid. I inserted my coins and pressed the start button. The digital display immediately lit up with a bright red number 45, indicating the total cycle time. Right as the water started flowing, the machine let out a loud, piercing electronic beep. It was a very distinct sound that echoed loudly against the bare concrete walls. I left my basket on the folding table and walked back up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I set a timer on my cell phone for exactly 40 minutes. I laid on my couch and watched television. When my phone alarm finally vibrated, I got up and walked back down to the basement to switch my clothes to the dryer. I pushed open the heavy metal door, fully expecting the washing machine to be in its final spin cycle. I walked over to machine number 4 and looked down at the digital display. My stomach dropped slightly. The bright red numbers on the screen did not say 5 minutes, they said 45. The machine was actively filling up with soapy water again. It had completely restarted. I stood there in the quiet basement, feeling very confused. I knew for a fact I had been sitting upstairs for 40 minutes. I figured the old machine just had a faulty internal computer and glitched out mid-cycle. I didn't want to waste more money on another machine, so I just sighed, pulled a hard plastic chair out from the corner, and sat down to wait the full 45 minutes. The cycle finished completely normally, and I eventually went back upstairs. 4 days later, it was Saturday night. I was doing another load of laundry right around the exact same time. I walked down to the empty basement, loaded my clothes into machine number 4, and pushed the start button. The display lit up with a 45, and the machine let out that exact same loud, piercing electronic beep. I turned around and started walking toward the fire door to head upstairs, but as I reached the exit, I realized I had completely forgotten to bring down my dryer sheets. I didn't want to forget them later, so I decided to just run up to my apartment, grab the box, and bring them down to leave on the table. I was gone for maybe 5 minutes tops. I grabbed the box from my kitchen cabinet, walked back down the stairs, and pushed the heavy fire door open. As soon as I stepped into the basement, something felt off. The washing machine wasn't making the heavy, sloshing sound of the wash cycle. It was making the light, spraying sound of the tub filling with water. I walked quickly over to machine number 4 and looked at the digital screen. The bright red numbers glowed in the dim light, 45. I felt uneasy. It wasn't just a glitch. The washing machines in my building are very old, top-loading models. The only physical way to completely reset the cycle timer back to 45 minutes is to manually pull the heavy metal lid entirely open and then slam it back shut. It cannot happen on its own. Someone had to physically walk up to my machine, lift the lid, and close it. I looked around the large, empty room. The harsh fluorescent lights cast deep shadows behind the row of tall dryers. I looked toward the back corner of the basement. The heavy wooden door leading to the boiler room, which was always firmly shut and locked, was now cracked open about 2 inches. A thick wall of absolute darkness spilled out from the narrow gap into the laundry area. I didn't want to be down there anymore. I backed away from the washing machines, keeping my eyes glued to that dark crack in the wooden door. I pushed through the fire door and practically ran up the stairs to my apartment. I locked my deadbolt and didn't go back down to retrieve my wet clothes until the sun came up the next morning. The basement was completely empty when I did. After that night, I strongly considered using a public laundromat, but a little over a week later, I was completely out of clean work uniforms and it was pouring rain outside. I had no other choice. I was forced to use the basement laundry room in my building again. It was a Wednesday night, just past 2 a.m. I walked down the concrete stairs, fully on edge. I pushed open the fire door and checked the entire room. It was completely empty. The boiler room door in the back corner was shut tight. I cautiously walked over to machine number 4, loaded my clothes, and pressed start. The display read 45, and the loud, piercing electronic beep echoed off the walls. This time I had absolutely no intention of leaving the room. I wanted to prove to myself that nobody was messing with me. I pulled the hard plastic chair against the wall right next to the heavy fire door. I had a clear view of the entire room, the row of washing machines, and the boiler room door in the back. I sat down, pulled out my phone, and settled in for the wait. The basement was incredibly quiet, save for the rhythmic sloshing of my clothes in the soapy water. I kept checking the digital display on the machine. 40, 35, 30. The timer was ticking down perfectly. It wasn't resetting. Right as the timer hit 20 minutes, I heard a sound. It was a slow, heavy metallic click coming from the back corner of the room. I slowly lowered my phone and looked up. The dull brass doorknob on the heavy wooden boiler room door was turning. I froze in my plastic chair. The wooden door slowly pulled inward, making a soft scraping noise against the concrete floor. It opened about 3 inches and then completely stopped. The boiler room inside was pitch black. I couldn't see anything inside the dark gap. I didn't move a single muscle. I just sat there against the far wall, staring directly at the crack in the door. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed. The washing machine kept running through its cycle perfectly. As I stared into the darkness, I started to hear a faint noise coming from inside the boiler room. It sounded like heavy, wet breathing. Someone was standing right behind that wooden door, just inches away from the gap, looking out into the laundry room. My stomach dropped all over again as a terrifying realization hit me. They weren't stepping out to reset the machine because I was sitting right there. The timer only reset when I physically left the room. They had been hiding in that dark, cramped boiler room the entire time, just waiting patiently for me to leave my clothes unattended so they could walk out and open the lid. The bright red numbers on the display finally ticked down to 0. The machine stopped spinning and let out one final, loud electronic beep. I stood up from my chair very slowly. My hands were shaking at my sides. I walked over to the washing machine, keeping my eyes completely locked on the dark gap in the boiler room door. I blindly reached into the wet tub, grabbed my heavy, soaking wet clothes in one massive pile, and shoved them into my plastic basket. I didn't bother putting them in the dryer. I turned around and walked backward toward the heavy metal fire door. As I reached the exit, I saw something move in the absolute darkness of the boiler room. A set of long, pale fingers slowly reached out from the pitch black and wrapped tightly around the outside edge of the wooden door. I threw my shoulder against the heavy fire door and bolted into the stairwell. I ran up the concrete steps as fast as my legs could carry me, struggling under the heavy weight of the wet laundry. As I reached the landing of the second floor, I heard the heavy fire door in the basement slam shut behind me. A few seconds later, echoing all the way up the quiet concrete stairwell, I heard a sound that made me feel completely sick. It was the loud, piercing electronic beep of the washing machine, starting a brand new cycle. I don't ever use the basement laundry room anymore, no matter what time of day it is. I gladly pay double to use the laundromat down the street. I still wonder about the person standing in the dark. Why did they want to keep me down in that basement for so long? Story 10. Everything started off normal at the office building, maybe a little too normal. My name is Marin Vale. I work as a senior financial analyst for a mid-sized logistics company, which basically means I spend my entire day staring at massive spreadsheets and balancing corporate accounts. Our company leases the entire 6th floor of a large commercial building located right in the middle of a busy downtown business district. During the normal working hours of the day, the floor is packed with people. Phones are constantly ringing, the large printers are always humming, and there is a steady stream of coworkers walking past my desk. But after 6 o'clock, the entire atmosphere of the building completely changes. The daytime staff packs up and goes home, and the floor becomes a complete ghost town. The cleaning crew usually comes through right around 7, emptying the trash cans and vacuuming the main lobby, but they are always gone before 8. After that, it is just you, the empty cubicles, and absolute silence. My private office is located at the very back of the floor, tucked away at the dead end of a long, narrow corridor. Because I handle sensitive financial documents, my office is the only one in that specific hallway without glass walls. It has a heavy, solid oak door. The doorknob isn't a standard round one. It is a thick, brushed steel lever that requires a decent amount of physical downward force to open. Every time I work late, I have a strict personal rule of twisting the small thumb lock on the inside of the handle. It just makes me feel a little bit more secure when I am the only person left on the entire floor. It was a Tuesday night right near the end of the fiscal quarter. That meant mandatory overtime for my department. It was around 8:30 p.m. and I was deeply focused on my computer screen, typing numbers into a database. The massive industrial HVAC system that controls the building's temperature had just powered down for the night, leaving my office incredibly quiet. As I was typing, I heard a very faint noise. It was a soft, metallic shifting sound. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel lever on my door moving just a tiny fraction of an inch and then settling back into place. I stopped typing and looked over at the closed wooden door. The handle was perfectly horizontal. I didn't hear any footsteps out in the carpeted hallway. I just assumed it was a sudden change in air pressure. When the heavy ventilation system kicks off in these old commercial buildings, the air pressure in the small rooms can change rapidly, causing the heavy wooden doors to rattle slightly against their metal frames. I shrugged it off, put my headphones on, and went right back to my spreadsheets. 2 nights later, on Thursday, I was working late again. It was closer to 9:30 p.m. this time. The building was completely deserted, and the silence felt a little heavier than usual. I was leaning back in my desk chair, rubbing my tired eyes, when I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't just a faint shift. It was a clear, distinct rattle of the brushed steel lever. It sounded like someone had brushed their hand aggressively against the metal handle while walking past my door in the narrow hallway. My stomach dropped slightly. I sat up in my chair and stared at the door. I waited to hear the muffled sound of footsteps walking away, or the heavy squeak of the exit door opening at the end of the hall, but there was nothing. I felt uneasy. I stood up from my desk, walked quietly over to my office door, and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the heavy oak door open and looked out into the corridor. The hallway was completely empty, but something felt off. The overhead lights in our office hallways are all equipped with motion sensors to save energy. If someone had just walked past my door, the fluorescent panels stretching all the way down the corridor should have been brightly illuminated, but they weren't. The lights near my office were on because of my movement, but the far end of the hallway was completely dark. No one had walked down that hall. I convinced myself that I was just severely sleep-deprived and hearing things. I locked my door firmly, packed up my laptop, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. I didn't want to stay in the building a minute longer than I had to. Then came Friday night. It was the absolute final deadline for our quarterly reports, and I had no choice but to stay until the work was completely finished. By the time 10:15 p.m. rolled around, I was the only car left in the underground parking garage, and the only person left on the entire 6th floor. I was sitting at my desk, trying to push through the final few pages of a document. The office was dead silent. Suddenly, I heard the heavy metallic shifting sound again. I immediately looked up from my bright monitor and locked my eyes on the steel lever. The handle was completely still. I sat perfectly frozen in my chair, just holding my breath and listening to the quiet hallway. Exactly 3 minutes later, the sound happened again. It was a slow, deliberate metallic friction noise. I watched the brushed steel lever jolt downward about half an inch, hold that position for a terrifying second, and then slowly slide back up to its resting horizontal state. Someone was standing right outside my closed office door. They weren't just brushing past it. They were placing their hand on the metal lever and testing the lock. My heart started beating much faster in my chest. I didn't say a word. I didn't call out to ask who was there. I just sat completely paralyzed behind my desk, staring at the wooden door. I knew the cleaning crew was gone. I knew the security guard stationed in the main lobby on the 1st floor never did physical rounds this late at night. The silence stretched on. I kept my eyes glued to the steel handle. I started counting the seconds in my head. 3 minutes later, it happened again. The heavy steel lever slowly depressed about an inch. I could hear the internal metal latch scraping against the strike plate inside the door frame. The person on the other side was being incredibly careful, trying to turn the handle as quietly as physically possible. They wanted to see if the door would simply push open. When the lock caught and prevented the lever from moving any further, the handle slowly slid back up. It was a calculated, terrifying pattern. They were waiting exactly 3 minutes between every single attempt, standing perfectly still in the dark hallway, testing the heavy lever over and over again. They were incredibly patient. I felt completely sick. I reached slowly across my desk, grabbed my cell phone, and opened my dialer. I didn't want to call 911 and have loud sirens pull up to the building if it was just a strange maintenance worker, so I typed in the direct number for the lobby security desk. I kept my thumb hovering over the call button, just watching the door. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the pattern changed. The heavy steel lever didn't just jolt. It began to turn downward in one slow, smooth, continuous motion. I watched in absolute disbelief as the thick brushed metal handle was pressed almost entirely to the bottom. The lock inside the wooden frame strained heavily under the pressure. The person out there wasn't just lightly testing it anymore. They were actively trying to force the latch down, applying their actual body weight to the metal lever. I couldn't just sit there anymore. The pure adrenaline finally forced me to move. I stood up from my desk. When I stood up, the wheels of my heavy office chair rolled backward across the hard plastic mat on the floor. It made a very loud, sharp scraping noise in the quiet room. The very second my chair made that noise, the heavy steel lever instantly snapped back up to its horizontal position. The person outside dropped the handle immediately. They knew I was awake. They knew I was standing right on the other side of the wood. I didn't hear a single footstep run away. I didn't hear the motion sensor lights click on in the hallway. I just grabbed my phone and pressed call. The security guard answered on the second ring. I kept my voice to a frantic whisper, telling him there was someone actively trying to break into my private office on the 6th floor. He told me to stay exactly where I was and keep the door locked. I stood behind my desk, gripping my phone, staring at the steel lever for what felt like an eternity. About 5 minutes later, I heard the loud, unmistakable sound of the heavy stairwell door swinging open at the end of the hall. I heard the guard's heavy boots walking down the corridor, accompanied by the bright clicking of the overhead fluorescent lights turning on one by one. "Security," his deep voice called out, followed by 3 loud knocks on my heavy oak door. "You're clear to open." I let out a massive breath, walked over to the door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the handle down. The guard was standing there with a heavy flashlight in his hand, looking slightly confused. He told me he had checked the entire hallway, the nearby bathrooms, and the emergency stairwell. The 6th floor was completely empty. He even checked the electronic badge logs for the main elevators. No one had scanned up to our floor since the daytime employees had left. I pointed to the heavy brushed steel lever on my door, trying to explain the slow, deliberate way it had been turning. I told him how much physical force it actually takes to push that specific handle down. It isn't something that can just slip or move on its own. It requires a firm, human grip. He kindly offered to escort me down to my car in the parking garage, which I immediately accepted. I packed up my things, leaving the quarterly reports unfinished on my desk, and practically ran to the elevator. I refused to ever work late in that building again. I told my manager that my internet connection at home was perfectly fine, and if I had to do overtime, I would be doing it from my own living room. They agreed after seeing how genuinely shaken I was. I still have to walk past that heavy oak door every single day, and every time I reach out to grab that thick brushed steel lever to open my office, I think about how slowly and carefully it moved that night. If I hadn't made that scraping noise with my chair, how much longer would they have stood out there in the dark? Story 11. I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at the nearly empty parking lot, but it did. My name is Nolan Rourke. A few years ago, I was working as a data entry specialist for a large medical billing company. The corporate office was located in a massive, sprawling business park on the far outskirts of the city. Because I was the newest hire in my department, I was assigned to the second shift. My hours were roughly 2 in the afternoon until 10:30 at night. By the time my shift finally ended and I clocked out, the entire corporate park was basically a ghost town. The building was surrounded by a massive parking lot designed to hold hundreds of employee vehicles during the busy daytime hours. But at night, it was just an endless flat expanse of dark asphalt. There were tall street lamps scattered throughout the lot, casting wide circles of harsh, dull orange light, but there were also plenty of wide gaps where the shadows were incredibly deep. I had a very strict routine. I always parked my car in the exact same spot every single day. I chose a space right in the middle of the lot, directly underneath one of the tall, humming street lamps. I just liked having my car bathed in that bright orange light. It made me feel a little bit more secure when I was making the long, isolated walk to my vehicle alone in the dark. It was a Tuesday night in early November. The weather had just started to turn freezing cold, so I had my heavy coat zipped all the way up and my hands shoved deep into my pockets. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby and started my normal walk across the asphalt. The only sound in the entire corporate park was the hollow, rhythmic echo of my own boots hitting the pavement. About halfway to my car, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Parked way out in the darkest, furthest corner of the lot, near the back exit, was another vehicle. It was a dark, older model sedan. The only reason I even noticed it in the shadows was because the small interior dome light on the ceiling of the car was turned on. It cast a very weak, yellowish glow throughout the dark cabin. I just assumed another late shift employee was sitting in their car, maybe warming up the engine or checking their text messages before making the long drive home. But as I kept walking and got a slightly better angle, I casually looked over. The interior of the sedan was completely empty. There was no driver behind the wheel, there was no passenger. It was just the bright yellow light shining down on the empty fabric seats. I figured whoever owned it had simply forgotten to push the button and left the light on by accident. I didn't give it a second thought. I got into my car, turned the heater on high, and drove home. The next night, Wednesday, I finished my shift right around 10:45 p.m. The parking lot was completely deserted, exactly as it always was. I stepped off the curb and started heading toward my usual spot under the street lamp. As I was walking, I saw the dark sedan again. It was still in the parking lot, but it wasn't parked in that dark, far corner anymore. It had been moved. It was now parked roughly 4 rows closer to the main building, resting right on the very edge of the light cast by the tall lamps, and the interior dome light was still on. I stopped walking for a second and just stared at the glowing yellow box of the car's interior. A car battery will usually completely die if you leave the interior lights turned on for an entire night and day. For that dome light to still be shining brightly 24 hours later, someone had to have driven the car, parked it in a new spot, and intentionally left the light switched on again. Something felt off. A very slight tension settled in my chest, but I kept my head down, walked quickly to my car, and left the lot without looking back. By Thursday, the weather had gotten significantly worse. It was a cold, steady, miserable rain that made the dark asphalt incredibly slick and reflective. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, opened my umbrella, and started my walk. I immediately looked for the dark sedan. It wasn't hard to find. It had moved again. This time it was parked directly in my row. It was sitting exactly 5 parking spaces away from my own car. The dull yellow interior light was piercing clearly through the rain and the fogged-up windows of the sedan. It was parked close enough now that I could clearly see deep scratches carved into the side panels and large patches of faded paint on the hood. I stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach dropped. This was absolutely not a coincidence anymore. The parking lot was massive, with literally hundreds of completely empty spaces to choose from. The fact that this specific car was slowly, steadily inching its way closer to my exact parking spot felt incredibly deliberate. It felt like a silent, calculated countdown. I stood there in the freezing rain, just listening to the soft, heavy patter of the water hitting my umbrella. I really didn't want to walk past it, but my car was the only way home. I took a deep breath and started walking, making sure to keep a very wide distance between myself and the glowing sedan. As I walked past it, I couldn't help but look through the wet glass. The yellow light illuminated the entire cabin perfectly. The seats were heavily stained. There were old, crumpled fast food wrappers and plastic bags scattered all over the floorboards, but it was still completely empty. There was no one crouching down or hiding in the back seat. I got to my car, got inside quickly, and locked the doors. I watched the glowing sedan in my rearview mirror until I completely turned out of the corporate park. I spent my entire shift on Friday dreading the inevitable walk to my car. I purposely stayed at my desk an extra 20 minutes after I clocked out, hoping that maybe, if someone was just playing a sick joke on me, they would get bored of waiting and finally leave. At 11:15 p.m., I finally forced myself to walk out the lobby doors. The rain had stopped earlier in the evening, but a very thick, heavy fog had rolled in over the asphalt. It made the tall street lamps look like blurry, glowing orange halos suspended in the air. I stepped off the curb and started walking. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, straining to see through the heavy mist to find my car. As I got closer to my spot, my heart started pounding heavily against my ribs. The dark sedan was there, but it wasn't 5 spaces away anymore. It was parked directly in the space right next to mine on the driver's side. It was pulled in so incredibly close to my car that there was barely enough room for me to even open my own door, and the dull yellow interior light was shining brightly, illuminating the side of my vehicle in the dark. I froze completely. I was about 30 feet away, standing entirely alone in the freezing fog. I felt uneasy. I knew for an absolute fact that the dark sedan had not been parked there when I arrived for my shift at 2 p.m. that afternoon. Someone had deliberately pulled into the lot, driven right up next to my car while I was inside working, and parked uncomfortably close. I refused to get any closer. I pulled my car keys out of my pocket and pressed the unlock button on my fob. The headlights of my car instantly flashed, cutting a bright beam through the thick fog. The exact second my headlights flashed, the interior dome light of the dark sedan simply clicked off. It didn't slowly fade out, it just shut off entirely, plunging the messy interior of the sedan into absolute pitch-black darkness. My stomach dropped. I stood there, completely paralyzed by the realization. Someone was inside the car right now. They had been sitting there in the dark, waiting patiently for me to approach, using the interior light to make sure I would look inside. The heavy, suffocating silence of the foggy parking lot was broken by a very soft, subtle sound. It came directly from the dark sedan. It sounded exactly like the heavy, metallic click of a manual door lock being forcefully pulled up. Then the heavy metal door on the driver's side of the sedan slowly began to push open. I didn't wait to see who was going to step out into the fog. I turned completely around and sprinted back toward the corporate office building as fast as I physically could. I didn't look over my shoulder. I just ran blindly through the mist until I hit the glass lobby doors, shoved my way inside, and locked them tightly behind me. I immediately used the lobby phone to call the police. They sent a patrol car out to the corporate park about 10 minutes later. By the time I finally walked back out into the lot with the two officers, the heavy fog had settled even lower to the ground. My car was sitting completely alone under the glowing orange street lamp. The dark sedan was gone. The police took a full report, but they honestly couldn't do much without a license plate number or a basic physical description of a suspect. I quit my job the very next week and found a daytime position closer to the city. I simply couldn't stomach the idea of walking out into that massive, empty parking lot every single night, constantly checking over my shoulder. I still think about that dark car, and the fact that it was empty every single night until the very end. Why did they want me to see the empty interior so clearly before they finally climbed inside? Story 12. I didn't realize anything was wrong with the bus window reflection until it was already too late. My name is Alara Quinn. I work as a shift manager at a 24-hour grocery store located near the busy commercial center of the city. I do not own a car, which means I rely entirely on the public transit system to get back and forth from my apartment. My schedule is almost always the same. I work the late afternoon to late evening block, meaning I usually clock out and walk to the main transit center right around 11:30 p.m. I always take the Route 42 bus. It is a very long, mostly boring ride that carries me away from the bright downtown streets and all the way out to the quiet, spread-out residential suburbs where I live. Because it is the absolute last scheduled bus of the night, it is almost always completely empty. Most nights, it is just me and the tired driver making the long loop in complete silence. The interior of the city buses are brightly lit with two long strips of harsh fluorescent lights that run the entire length of the ceiling. When it is pitch black outside, those bright interior lights cause the large glass windows to act exactly like mirrors. The contrast between the dark night and the lit cabin makes the glass highly reflective. I have a very strict routine when I ride. I always board the bus, walk exactly halfway down the center aisle, and choose a window seat on the left side. I like to rest the side of my head against the cold glass and just zone out to the low, steady humming of the heavy diesel engine. It was a Tuesday night in early April. I was incredibly tired after spending 8 hours dealing with angry customers and heavy inventory boxes. I boarded the empty bus, gave the driver a polite nod, and walked straight back to my usual seat. I sat down, placed my heavy work bag on the empty fabric seat next to me, and leaned my head against the window. The bus pulled away from the transit center curb with a loud hiss of the air brakes. I was just staring blankly at my own tired reflection in the glass. The city streets outside were dark, with only the occasional blurry orange streak of a passing street lamp cutting through the window. After about 15 minutes, the route took us down a very long, unlit stretch of road that borders a massive public park. With absolutely no outside streetlights shining in, the window beside me became a perfect, solid mirror. I was looking passively at my own face when I noticed a small, strange detail. In the reflection of the glass, right in the seat directly behind mine, there was a dark, blurry shape. It looked exactly like a heavy, greasy smudge on the outside of the window, but the shape itself was very specific. It looked exactly like the rounded, sloping curve of a person's shoulder and the side of their head. I really didn't think much of it at the time. The city buses are notoriously dirty, and they often go weeks without being properly washed. I just figured a tall person had leaned against the outside of the bus at a previous stop, leaving a large smear of dirt and oil on the glass. I shifted my focus away from the smudge, closed my eyes, and listened to the engine for the rest of the ride home. The next night, Wednesday, the weather was terrible. It was a slow, miserable, freezing rain that made the city look completely washed out and gray. I finished my shift, walked quickly to the transit center under my umbrella, and boarded the Route 42 bus. Just like the night before, the vehicle was completely deserted. I walked down the aisle, took my usual seat on the left side, and settled in. I put my bag down next to me and looked out the window. The outside of the glass was covered in tiny, streaking water droplets. As the bus drove away from the downtown area and entered the darker residential streets by the park, the bright interior lights reflected strongly against the wet glass once again. I looked at my reflection. My stomach dropped. The dark shape was there again, but it wasn't a blurry, dirty smudge on the outside of the glass anymore. It was completely clear. In the sharp reflection of the window, I could easily see the solid silhouette of a person sitting in the seat directly behind me. It was a tall, heavy figure wearing a thick, dark jacket. They were sitting perfectly still, facing straight forward, their hands resting flat on their lap. I immediately turned my head and looked quickly over my shoulder at the physical seat behind me. It was completely empty. The ugly, patterned fabric of the seat was completely bare. There was no one sitting there. The entire back half of the long bus was completely deserted. The only sound in the cabin was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the large tires rolling over the wet asphalt. I felt uneasy. A thin layer of cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I slowly turned my head back around, facing forward again. I tentatively shifted my eyes sideways, looking directly into the window. The reflection was still there. The dark, heavy figure was sitting directly behind my reflection, perfectly still, undisturbed by the movement of the bus. I desperately tried to logically figure out what I was seeing. I told myself it must be a strange optical illusion caused by the geometry of the bus interior. I thought maybe the tall plastic divider positioned directly behind the driver's seat was somehow casting a weird, distorted shadow all the way down the center aisle. I needed to test it. I sat up perfectly straight, slowly raised my right hand, and waved it gently in front of my face. My reflection in the glass waved back in perfect sync. The dark figure behind me did not move a single inch. I spent the remaining 20 minutes of the bus ride sitting perfectly rigid. I stared straight ahead at the back of the plastic seat in front of me, completely refusing to look at the window again. When my stop finally arrived, I grabbed my bag and practically ran off the bus into the freezing rain, not looking back once. I spent my entire Thursday shift trying to convince myself it was just a severe trick of the light. I told myself that the curved safety glass of the bus windows naturally distorted the interior reflections, especially when covered in rain. I desperately wanted to believe there was a normal, boring explanation. I didn't own a car, and an expensive rideshare was simply out of my daily budget. I had no other way to get home. At 11:30 p.m., I boarded the bus. The driver was a different man tonight, an older guy who didn't even look up from the steering wheel as I scanned my transit pass. The bus was, as always, completely empty. I stood in the center aisle, looking back at my usual seat on the left side. I really wanted to sit somewhere else. I strongly considered taking a seat right at the very front, directly across from the driver. But a stubborn, logical part of my brain refused to be intimidated by a simple shadow. I needed to sit there and prove to myself that it was just a harmless reflection caused by the overhead lights. I walked down the aisle, sat in my usual seat, and put my heavy work bag down. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the window. We were still sitting under the bright, overwhelming halogen lights of the main transit center, so I could see clearly out into the parking lot. There was no reflection at all. The glass was perfectly transparent. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my anxiety. I relaxed my shoulders, leaned my head back against the seat, and let out a long breath. The bus pulled out of the station and started its long, familiar route. About 15 minutes later, we reached that long, dark stretch of road next to the public park. The outside world went completely black, and the window beside me instantly turned into a sharp, clear mirror once again. I looked at the glass. The dark figure was not just sitting there anymore. In the reflection, the heavy silhouette had shifted entirely. They They were no longer resting calmly against the back of their seat. They were leaning incredibly far forward. The dark, featureless shape of their head was hovering just inches away from the back of my own reflection's neck. Something felt off. The air around me suddenly felt incredibly dense, almost suffocating in the small space. The normal, comforting hum of the diesel engine suddenly seemed muffled and very distant, like I was underwater. I was completely paralyzed. My hands were gripping the fabric of my work pants so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I just stared wide-eyed at the reflection in the window, completely unable to look away. I watched in absolute disbelief as the dark figure slowly began to move. In the glass, I saw a long, shadowy arm slowly rise from the figure's side. It extended forward with a smooth, deliberate motion, reaching directly toward the reflection of my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to break eye contact with the mirror. I knew for an absolute fact that the physical seat behind me was supposed to be completely empty. But then I heard a sound. It came from directly behind my head. It was a slow, distinct shifting noise. It sounded exactly like heavy fabric rubbing firmly against the cheap plastic shell of the bus seat. Then, cutting through the silence of the empty bus, I heard the undeniable, high-pitched squeak of the metal seat springs compressing forcefully under a very heavy weight. Someone was physically shifting their weight in the seat directly behind me. I didn't hesitate for another second. I threw myself violently sideways out of my seat, completely abandoning my heavy work bag. I stumbled out into the center aisle, tripping over my own feet, and spun around to face the back of the bus. The seat behind mine was completely empty. The ugly patterned fabric was completely undisturbed. The metal frame was perfectly still. There was no one standing in the aisle, and there was no one hiding in the very back row. But the heavy, metallic squeaking sound of the springs slowly decompressing echoed clearly in the quiet bus, sounding exactly as if a heavy person had just stood up from the cushion. I backed away down the aisle, moving as fast as I could toward the front of the bus. I didn't take my eyes off that empty seat until I reached the yellow safety line right next to the driver. I stood there, trembling uncontrollably, holding tightly onto the metal support pole for the rest of the ride. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't even form the words to respond. I just shook my head. When the bus finally reached my stop, I practically jumped off the bottom step and walked the rest of the way home in complete, terrifying silence. I had to buy a brand new work bag the next day because I absolutely refused to ever get back on that specific bus to retrieve my old one from the lost and found. I still have to take the public transit system to get home from work every night, but I take a completely different, complicated route now, even though it adds an extra 40 minutes to my commute. And no matter how incredibly empty the bus is, I never ever sit by the window. I still think about that dark stretch of road by the park, and the heavy squeaking sound of those metal springs adjusting right behind my head. If there was no one actually sitting behind me, then what exactly was casting a reflection? Story 13. I almost didn't go to the storage facility that night, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. My name is Garrett Solis. Last year I went through a very sudden, incredibly messy situation with my roommate, which forced me to move out of our shared apartment with almost no notice. Because I didn't have a new place lined up yet, I had to rent a large 10 by 15 storage unit on the edge of town to hold all of my furniture and personal belongings. I was crashing on a friend's couch temporarily, so almost everything I owned went straight into that unit. The storage facility was a massive, newly built, 3-story concrete building located right off the main highway. It was fully automated and open 24 hours a day. There were no employees on site after 6 p.m. to get inside. You just had to punch your unique access code into a keypad by the front sliding glass doors, and then use the code again to activate the large freight elevators. Because I worked a very weird, rotating schedule at a local distribution center, I usually only had free time to move my heavy boxes during the late night hours. I actually preferred going at night. The massive building was always completely deserted, and I could use the large, flatbed moving carts without having to wait in line behind other customers. My specific unit was located on the 3rd floor, situated roughly halfway down a very long, narrow corridor. The building had bare, polished concrete floors and endless rows of identical, bright orange metal roll-up doors. To save on electricity, the facility used motion sensor lighting. The overhead fluorescent panels would only click on when you walked directly underneath them. If you stood perfectly still for too long, the lights would shut off with a loud thud, plunging the entire hallway into absolute darkness. It was a Thursday night, right around 11:30 p.m., when I had my first strange experience. I was dropping off a few heavy boxes filled with winter clothes and an old wooden coffee table. I used the freight elevator, wheeled my cart down the long hallway, and unlocked my unit. For security, I had purchased a very thick, heavy brass padlock. Whenever you pushed the heavy shackle down to lock it, it made a very loud, distinct metallic click that echoed loudly against the concrete walls. I arranged the boxes inside, pulled the heavy orange metal door down to the floor, and squeezed the brass padlock shut. Click. I turned around and started walking back down the long corridor toward the elevator. The sound of my work boots hitting the concrete was the only noise in the entire building. When I was about 30 feet away from my unit, I heard a sound. It was a very faint, slow tapping sound. It sounded exactly like someone gently rapping their bare knuckles against a piece of thin sheet metal. The sound was coming from directly behind me. I stopped walking and turned around. The long hallway was completely empty. The bright orange doors were all shut tight. I stood there for a few seconds, just listening to the silence of the building. The tapping sound had completely stopped the exact moment I stopped walking. I simply shrugged it off. These massive metal buildings are constantly expanding and contracting with the temperature changes, and the thin roll-up doors are notoriously noisy. I assumed it was just the metal door of my unit settling into its tracks after being slammed shut. I walked to the elevator and drove home to my friend's apartment. A little over a week later, I was back at the facility. It was a Tuesday, and it was much later this time. Closer to 1:15 a.m., the massive concrete building felt incredibly isolating. The silence inside was so heavy that it almost made my ears ring. I had just finished unloading several heavy crates of books into my unit. I pulled the orange door down, secured the heavy brass padlock, and listened to the loud click echo down the hall. I pushed my empty flatbed cart away from the door and started making the long walk toward the elevator. I reached the very end of the corridor, right before the hallway turned a sharp corner toward the elevator bank. As I grabbed the metal handle of my cart to turn the corner, I heard the noise again. It was that same tapping sound hitting the thin sheet metal, but this time it was significantly louder. It wasn't a random, settling noise. It had a very clear, deliberate rhythm. It was a steady, consistent beat coming directly from the hallway behind me. I left my cart at the corner and slowly walked back around to look down the corridor. The tapping sound was undeniably coming from the inside of my specific unit. Someone or something was on the other side of my bright orange door, gently striking the metal from the inside. Something felt off. A very slight, uncomfortable tension formed in the back of my neck. I stood at the end of the hall and watched my door. I took 3 slow steps down the corridor, moving back toward my unit. The absolute second my boots scuffed against the concrete floor, the tapping sound completely ceased. Total silence returned to the hallway. I walked all the way up to my door and pressed the side of my face against the cold orange metal. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement inside the 10 by 15 room. There was nothing. No shifting boxes, no footsteps, no breathing. I felt uneasy. I knew for an absolute fact that I had the only 2 keys to that heavy brass padlock on my keychain. The unit had been completely empty when I first rented it. There was no physical way for a person to be inside my locked room. I tried to convince myself that maybe there was a rat or some other large pest trapped inside the building's ventilation system that ran directly over the units. It was a weak excuse, but it was the only logical explanation I could come up with. I walked away slightly unnerved, but trying not to let my imagination run wild. I didn't return to the facility for another 2 weeks. I only had one final trip to make. I needed to move my large, heavy mattress and a few remaining framed pictures. It was a Sunday night, well past 2 a.m. The weather outside was terrible, pouring heavy, freezing rain against the metal roof of the massive building. The sound of the rain was a dull, constant roar overhead, masking the usual dead silence of the facility. I pushed my cart down the hall, unlocked the brass padlock, and rolled the heavy door upward. My unit was getting incredibly full. It was basically a solid wall of stacked cardboard boxes and old furniture. I managed to squeeze the heavy mattress inside, sliding it all the way to the very back of the unit. I leaned it perfectly upright against the far concrete wall, right behind a towering stack of plastic storage bins. I stepped out of the unit, pulled the metal door down, and squeezed the brass padlock shut. Click. This time I was absolutely determined to figure out what was making that strange noise. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just settling pipes or a loose draft in the ceiling. Instead of walking away toward the elevator, I just stood there. I leaned my shoulder firmly against the concrete wall directly next to my unit's door. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, turned the screen brightness all the way down, and just waited quietly. I stood there for 5 full minutes. The motion sensor lights above me finally timed out, plunging my section of the hallway into absolute pitch-black darkness. I didn't move. I just stood there in the dark, listening intently over the dull roar of the rain hitting the roof. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Absolutely nothing happened. There was not a single sound coming from inside my unit. The metal door remained completely silent. I let out a long, quiet sigh. I figured I had just been overly paranoid during my last few visits. Sleep deprivation and moving stress were clearly playing tricks on my mind. I waved my arm upward in the dark, triggering the motion sensor and flooding the hallway with harsh fluorescent light again. I turned away from my unit and started walking down the corridor, but this time I intentionally walked very softly. I placed my boots down carefully, trying not to make my usual loud, echoing footsteps on the concrete. I reached the end of the long hall. I stepped completely around the corner, hiding myself from the view of my corridor, and stood next to my empty flatbed cart. The exact second I stepped around the corner, a loud, frantic tapping sound erupted from my unit. It wasn't slow or faint anymore. It was incredibly urgent. It sounded exactly like someone was desperately hammering their open palms against the inside of the roll-up door. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the chest. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't a rat in the vents. Whatever was inside my locked unit was actively listening for me to leave. It was waiting for the sound of my footsteps to fade away. It only made the noise when it was absolutely sure my back was turned and I was walking away. I slowly peeked my head back around the corner. The hallway was completely empty. The frantic smacking against the metal door was echoing loudly down the corridor. I stepped out from behind the corner. I didn't try to be quiet this time. I stomped my heavy work boot down hard against the concrete. The tapping sound stopped instantly. The heavy, suffocating silence rushed back into the hallway, broken only by the muffled rain on the roof. I stood there for a long time, completely frozen, trying to decide what to do. I should have just turned around, taken the elevator down to my car, and called the police. But a terrifying, irrational part of my brain needed to know what was inside my property. I slowly walked all the way back down the long corridor. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold my keys. I reached my orange door, grabbed the thick brass padlock, and slid the key inside. It made a loud, heavy click as the metal shackle popped open. I grabbed the metal handle at the bottom of the door, took a deep breath, and forcefully shoved the roll-up door upward. It made a massive, grinding roar as it coiled into the ceiling. The harsh fluorescent light from the hallway spilled directly into the 10 by 15 room. Everything looked exactly how I had left it just 20 minutes ago. The wall of stacked cardboard boxes was perfectly intact. The old wooden coffee table was sitting undisturbed. The heavy mattress was still leaning upright against the far concrete wall in the back. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see anything out of place. I cautiously took one single step over the threshold, leaning my body slightly into the unit. As I stood there looking at the clutter, I heard a sound. It came from the very back of the unit, completely hidden in the dark, narrow gap between the concrete wall and the heavy mattress I had just leaned against it. It was a soft, steady scraping noise. It sounded exactly like heavy fabric slowly shifting against the bare concrete floor. Someone was wedged directly behind the mattress. They were adjusting their position in the dark, narrow gap. I didn't yell out. I didn't demand to know who they were. The sheer, overwhelming instinct to survive completely took over my body. I lunged backward out of the unit, practically falling into the bright hallway. I reached out, grabbed the metal handle of the door, and violently slammed it down to the floor. I shoved the brass padlock through the metal latch and squeezed it shut with both hands. I didn't bother grabbing my flatbed cart. I turned around and sprinted down the concrete hallway as fast as my legs could physically carry me. I slammed my hand against the elevator button, rode it down to the lobby, and ran out into the freezing rain. I locked the doors of my car and sped out of the facility parking lot, completely running a red light to get onto the highway. It has been almost 4 months since that night. I still pay the monthly storage fee automatically through my online bank account. I have thousands of dollars worth of furniture, electronics, and personal memories locked away inside that room, but I absolutely refuse to ever go back to that facility. I haven't even called the management office to report it because I don't want anyone opening that door. I constantly think about the layout of that unit and how perfectly hidden that dark gap behind the mattress was. How long can someone survive inside a locked room? Story 14. I was alone at the nearly empty movie theater, which wasn't unusual, but something about that night just felt different. My name is Sienna Verk. I have always been a massive fan of movies, but I absolutely hate dealing with large, noisy crowds. To avoid packed auditoriums, I usually go to the older second-run multiplex located on the quiet side of town. It is a massive, outdated building with faded red carpets, incredibly dim amber lighting in the long hallways, and a permanent smell of stale popcorn in the air. Because I only go late on weeknights, usually for the 10:30 p.m. showings, the building is almost always a complete ghost town. There's usually only one tired teenager working the front ticket booth, and the vast majority of the individual screening rooms are entirely deserted. I love the heavy silence of the place. I love being able to pick any seat in the room without having to worry about someone kicking the back of my chair. It was a quiet Tuesday night when I had my first strange experience. I bought a ticket for a comedy playing in auditorium number 4. I walked down the long, empty corridor, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The previews were already rolling on the massive screen. The room was completely dark and completely empty. I walked down the sloped, sticky carpet of the center aisle and picked a random row near the exact middle of the room. I walked past a few empty chairs and sat down, placing my large drink in the cup holder to my left. I settled into the heavy fabric seat and casually rested my right arm on the shared plastic armrest that separated me from the empty seat to my right. The moment I put my weight down, I felt a sharp poke against the side of my palm. I pulled my hand back and rubbed my thumb slowly over the top of the plastic armrest. The small, rectangular metal tag that displayed the seat number was damaged. The top right corner of the thin metal was bent sharply upward, creating a jagged edge that stuck up about an inch into the air. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket to make sure it hadn't cut my skin. In the dim, glowing light of my phone screen, I looked down at the bent tag. It was seat number 14. I noticed a very distinct, deep diagonal scratch carved aggressively across the black painted number on the metal. I just assumed it was typical wear and tear for a rundown theater. The seats were probably 30 years old and teenagers destroy things all the time. I simply shifted my body weight to the left, ignored the sharp edge on my right, and watched the movie in peace. I completely forgot about it by the time I drove home. A little over a week later, on a Thursday night, I returned to see a completely different movie. This time my ticket was for auditorium number 7. It was located on the absolute opposite side of the massive building. Just like before, the room was a dark, deserted cavern. I decided to change up my routine. Instead of sitting in the middle, I walked all the way up the steep concrete stairs to the stadium seating section near the very back wall. I picked a random row, stepped over a few folded seats, and sat down. The theater was dead silent, save for the low, continuous humming of the digital projector operating in the booth behind me. I took off my light jacket and placed it on the empty seat to my right. As my hand brushed against the dividing armrest, my sweater sleeve caught firmly on a sharp piece of metal. My stomach dropped slightly. I knew exactly what that sharp edge felt like. I immediately reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned the screen brightness all the way up. I held the glowing white square over the plastic armrest of the empty seat beside me. It was the bent metal number tag. The top right corner was pried sharply upward, pointing into the air. But it wasn't just a similarly damaged tag. I leaned in and looked very closely at the black painted numbers. It was seat number 14, and it had the exact same deep, diagonal scratch carved heavily across the paint. Something felt off. A very tight, uncomfortable tension formed in my chest. I knew for an absolute fact that theater seats are permanently bolted down to the concrete floors. The hard plastic armrests are securely attached to the heavy metal frames. For that exact same metal tag to be sitting here in a completely different auditorium, in a completely different row, someone had to have manually unscrewed it from the seat in Theater 4 and intentionally reattached it right next to where I decided to sit tonight. I felt uneasy. I slowly looked around the dark, empty auditorium. The glowing red exit signs cast long, distorted shadows over the dozens of empty rows. I was completely alone. I didn't hear anyone breathing in the dark. I didn't see anyone crouching behind the seats. I desperately tried to rationalize the situation. I told myself that I must have just misremembered which theater room I was actually in last week. Maybe I had been in Auditorium 7 the whole time and my brain was just confusing the numbers. It was a very weak excuse, but I refused to let my paranoia ruin my night out. I kept my arms firmly in my lap for the rest of the movie and left the building as soon as the credits rolled. Almost 3 weeks passed without me going to the movies. I was busy with work, and honestly, the thought of the dark, empty theater just made me feel anxious. but eventually, a movie I had been waiting months to see finally premiered, and I couldn't resist going. It was a Monday night. The weather outside was terrible, pouring heavy, freezing rain against the flat roof of the multiplex. I walked inside, bought my ticket from the bored teenager at the glass booth, and walked down the dim amber hallway to auditorium number 2. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped inside. It was pitch black, with only the silent trivia slides playing on the massive screen to illuminate the room. I decided I was going to prove to myself that it was all just a massive, stupid coincidence. I wasn't going to sit in the middle, and I wasn't going to sit in the back. I walked all the way down the long, sloping, carpeted aisle until I reached the very second row from the massive screen. It was a terrible place to sit, forcing you to crane your neck upward, but it was a place I never, ever chose. I walked to the exact center of the long row and sat down in the heavy fabric chair. Before I even took my wet coat off, I pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed the dim screen light and turned on the actual blinding LED flashlight feature. I pointed the bright beam directly at the plastic armrest of the empty seat to my right. The small metal number tag was perfectly flat. It was screwed tightly against the hard plastic, completely smooth and undamaged. There were no deep diagonal scratches on the clean black paint. It was seat number 8. I let out a long, heavy breath. All the tension slowly left my shoulders. I felt completely ridiculous for being so paranoid over a broken piece of metal. I turned my flashlight off, shoved my phone deep into my pocket, and got comfortable in the chair. The movie started a few minutes later. It was a very slow, quiet psychological thriller. About an hour into the film, there was a very long, incredibly tense scene with absolutely no background music and barely any dialogue. The silence inside the large auditorium was heavy and absolute. As I was staring intensely at the bright screen, I heard a sound. It was a very slow, deliberate scraping noise. It sounded exactly like a thick piece of metal being forcefully wedged underneath a tight screw. The sound was coming from directly to my right. It was coming from the empty seat right next to me. I completely froze. My breathing stopped entirely. I knew for an absolute fact that I was the only person who had walked down that long, illuminated aisle. I had a perfectly clear view of the entire room when I sat down. No one had walked past me. No one had entered the row. In the dim, flickering light reflecting off the massive movie screen, I didn't turn my head. I just slowly shifted my eyes sideways to look into the dark space beside me. Sitting in the seat directly next to mine was the solid, dark silhouette of a person. They were sitting perfectly still, hunched over slightly in the dark chair. They were wearing a dark, heavy hooded sweatshirt pulled up over their head. In order to get into that seat without me seeing or hearing them enter the row, they had to have crawled down the entire length of the sticky carpeted aisle on their hands and knees in the absolute dark. I was completely paralyzed. I watched as a pale, dirty hand slowly retreated from the armrest between us and retreated back into the heavy shadows of the hoodie. I slowly looked down at the plastic divider. The small metal number tag was now bent sharply upward, pointing a jagged edge into the air. The person sitting in the dark had just silently pried it up with a tool while I was staring blankly at the movie screen. I didn't scream. I didn't demand to know who they were. The sheer, overwhelming instinct to survive completely took over my entire body. I stood up from my chair so fast that the heavy seat cushion slammed loudly against the backrest. I completely abandoned my purse, my umbrella, and my winter coat. I threw myself sideways into the empty aisle, keeping my eyes locked on the dark figure in the seat, and then I turned and ran. I sprinted up the long, sloping, carpeted ramp as fast as my legs could physically carry me. I slammed my hands against the heavy wooden doors, burst out into the dim amber hallway, and didn't stop running until I was standing outside in the freezing rain. I locked the doors of my car and drove straight to the local police station. They sent 2 officers to search the theater, but by the time they walked into auditorium number 2 with their heavy flashlights, the room was completely empty. My purse and my coat were still sitting in the second row, completely untouched. I never went back to that multiplex again. I gladly drive 30 minutes out of my way to go to the loud, expensive, crowded theaters in the neighboring city now. And no matter how many people are sitting in the room, I always run my hand over the plastic armrests before I sit down. I still think about that dark silhouette sitting, perfectly still in the flickering light of the movie screen. If the theater was completely empty, why did they need to bend the metal before they sat beside me? Story 15. It was around the time I started using my laptop late at night when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Dax Corwin. I live alone in a small apartment. I work as an independent freelance transcriptionist. That means I spend my days wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones, typing exactly what I hear into a word processor. I prefer to do my work in the dead of night when everything is completely quiet. My apartment is incredibly peaceful at 2 in the morning. The carpet is a dull gray, and the walls are completely bare, which makes the silence feel even heavier when I am working alone. My workspace is very simple. I have a plain wooden desk pushed into the far corner of my bedroom. The desk faces the wall, meaning my back is completely exposed to the room while I work. Sitting on that desk is a generic silver laptop that I purchased second-hand a few months ago. Built flush into the top bezel of the screen is a standard webcam. Right next to the glass lens is a tiny, pinhole-sized LED indicator light. It was a Tuesday night, right around 1:15 a.m. I was deeply focused on a very long audio file. I did not have any video conferencing applications open. I wasn't running any web browsers or background recording software. It was just me and the text document. As I was typing, a sudden flash of color caught my attention. I stopped typing and looked up at the top edge of my screen. The tiny LED indicator light next to the webcam had just turned on. It was a sharp green dot shining clearly in the dim lighting of my bedroom. It remained completely solid for about 3 seconds, and then it simply clicked off. I sat perfectly still, staring at the small black circle of the lens. I opened my task manager and scrolled through the active processes. There was absolutely nothing utilizing the camera. I closed the window and continued typing until the sun came up. 2 nights later, on Thursday, I was sitting at my desk again. It was much later this time. Pushing 3:30 a.m., the apartment building was completely dead. I had just finished my last audio file, so I had taken my headphones off. The silence in the bedroom was heavy and isolating. I was leaning in close to the monitor when the bright green light suddenly snapped on again. This time it didn't just flash, it stayed on. The bright green dot glowed steadily, staring back at me like a tiny, unblinking eye. Something felt off. A very slight, uncomfortable tension settled in my chest. I sat back in my chair and looked directly into the dark glass of the lens. I felt uneasy. I opened my system settings and checked the internal hardware manager. According to the computer's operating system, the webcam was completely deactivated. There were no hidden apps running. There were no background tasks requesting video access, but the light was still shining brightly. It felt incredibly invasive. It felt exactly like someone was sitting directly on the other side of that screen, watching me in my quiet bedroom. I reached my hand upward, extended my index finger, and pressed it firmly over the small camera lens, completely blocking its view. The exact millisecond my fingertip covered the glass, the green light clicked off. My stomach dropped. I knew right then that someone was sitting on the other end of that connection, watching me. I quickly opened my desk drawer, grabbed a small roll of thick black electrical tape, and tore off a square piece. I pressed the dark tape squarely over the camera lens and the indicator light. I shut the laptop down and went to bed feeling incredibly paranoid. I spent my entire Friday completely ignoring the silver laptop, but by Saturday night, I received an urgent project from a client that I couldn't afford to turn down. I sat down at my desk right around midnight. I left the black electrical tape securely in place over the lens and booted up the machine. I worked in a state of high anxiety for hours. I kept my eyes constantly darting up to the top bezel, waiting to see if a green glow would bleed through the tape. The room felt suffocating. Every time the floorboards settled, I flinched, but the light never turned back on. By 4 a.m., I finally finished the transcription. I navigated to the start menu, clicked the shutdown prompt, and watched the screen go completely black. I listened as the internal cooling fan slowly spun down until the machine was entirely silent. Then I firmly pushed the heavy silver lid down. It made a solid click as it closed flush against the keyboard base. I turned off the small lamp on my desk and crawled into bed. It usually takes me a while to fall asleep after working, but exhaustion took over quickly. The room was pitch black, and the silence of the early morning hours was absolute. I woke up suddenly a few hours later. I didn't know exactly what time it was, but the apartment was still deeply shadowed. My throat was incredibly dry, so I sat up slowly, planning to walk out to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and placed my bare feet on the cold carpet, I looked across the dark bedroom toward my wooden desk. My stomach dropped all over again, hitting me with a heavy, sickening weight. Sitting on the desk in the far corner of the room was my closed silver laptop, but the corner of the room was not completely dark. Shining clearly through the very thin, horizontal gap between the closed lid and the base of the keyboard was a distinct, bright green glow. The camera light was on. The laptop was completely shut down. The lid was physically closed. I had personally watched the screen go black and heard the internal fan stop spinning. There was absolutely no power running to the machine. I sat perfectly frozen on the edge of my bed, just staring at that thin sliver of green light. I felt a deep knot form in my throat. The heavy silver lid was firmly shut, pressing the camera directly against the dark plastic of the keyboard. I couldn't see anything inside the room. But then I heard a sound in the dead silence of the room. It was a very soft, steady noise coming directly from the closed laptop on the desk. It sounded exactly like the small internal hard drive quietly spinning up, writing data to the disk. Following the spinning sound was a faint, static hum. It was the distinct sound of the internal microphone actively drawing power. They were listening to me. Someone was sitting on the other end of that connection, recording the quiet sounds of me sleeping in the middle of the night. I didn't turn on my bedside lamp. I didn't want to make a single sound to let them know I was awake. I slowly stood up from my bed, keeping my weight distributed evenly so the floorboards wouldn't shift. I walked silently across the carpeted floor until I was standing right next to the wooden desk. I grabbed the thick black power cord from the wall outlet and yanked it out as hard as I physically could. The faint green glow cutting through the horizontal gap immediately died. The soft static hum of the microphone stopped. The laptop was completely dead. I didn't go back to sleep. I picked up the heavy silver laptop, walked out my front door, and locked it securely in the trunk of my car. I bought a cheap, brand new computer the very next afternoon. It has been nearly 6 months since that night. I still work my late night shifts, and my apartment is just as quiet as it always was. I never opened that heavy silver lid again. I brought the laptop back inside and shoved it onto the very top shelf of my hallway closet, buried underneath a pile of heavy winter blankets. The battery has to be completely drained by now. But sometimes, when I walk past the closet in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, I stop and look at the narrow gap under the wooden closet door. And occasionally, reflecting faintly against the hardwood floor in the pitch-black hallway, I can still see a bright green glow shining from the top shelf. Who is still trying to listen to me?